While something like the Holocaust isn't exactly unprecedented in history, with mass genocide popping up an unnerving number of times the world over throughout humans humaning, perhaps no other instance of this has shocked the modern world more than the Nazis systematically murdering somewhere in the ballpark of 5 or 6 million Jewish people, along with another 5 or 6 million people of other backgrounds, such as the lesser talked about Romani genocide. In this one, the Nazis murdered upwards of 1 million Romani, which was about half the entire Romani population of Europe at the time. That any civilized people could allow something like this to go on seems unthinkable to our modern selves. So the question becomes, how much did the general public actually know about what was going on at the time it was happening? It turns out, contrary to what is often stated, quite a lot actually, both on the global scale and even within Germany itself. Evidence pointing to at least the idea that it was happening being relatively common knowledge, as we'll get into shortly. But also, paradoxically, by accounts from many people directly after the war, they didn't really know at all. So, well, which is true. To really get to the bottom of this, we must discuss events leading up to the Holocaust and how much of these the German people and wider world knew about. To begin with, when Hitler and his cohorts first came to power in 1933, some of the first things that they did were to suspend the civil liberties of the German people, such as now allowing imprisonment of citizens without trial. It's always a good sign that you've chosen your leaders well. More pertinent to the topic at hand, doubling down on the ominous tone of the new regime, within a few months the Nazis had established their first concentration camp in Dachau. The main purpose of this new facility was to hold political dissidents, among other undesirables. You see, the existing prison systems were deemed insufficient to be able to house the number that needed to be rounded up. Not mincing words about how prisoners would be treated there, SS official Johann Erasmus Freiherr von Mausen-Ponickau gave this speech to members of the SS at Dachau shortly after it opened. You all know what the Führer has called us to do. We have not come here for human encounters with those pigs in there. We do not consider them human beings as we are, but as second-class people. For years, they have been able to continue their criminal existence. But now we are in power. If those pigs had come to power, they would have cut off all of our heads. Therefore, we have no room for sentimentalism. If anyone here cannot bear to see the blood of comrades, he does not belong and had better leave. The more of these pig dogs we strike down, the fewer we need to feed. Not long after this, a rather bloody purge, the Night of the Long Knives, occurred, and in the aftermath, Hitler not only was declared Führer, but also justified the murders, noting that it was done to protect Germany, publicly stating, "If anyone reproaches me and asks why I did not resort to the regular courts of justice, then all I can say is this. In this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and thereby I became the supreme judge of the German people. I gave the order to shoot the ringleaders in this treason, and I further gave the order to cauterize down to the raw flesh the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells in our domestic life. Let the nation know that its existence, which depends on its internal order and security, cannot be threatened with impunity by anyone. And let it be known for all time to come that if anyone raises his hand to strike the state, then certain death is his lot." Noteworthy here was that no real evidence was presented that any of these people had actually been planning a coup or anything of the sort. Hitler simply publicly stated they were, and as a result, he had them killed without trial. Going back to the concentration camps and the roundup of dissidents, while some of the atrocities being committed there were mostly kept under wraps in the media, the government were none too shy about broadcasting the roundups and existence of these facilities in the media precisely to help make anyone afraid to step out of line. It would also seem the Nazis had a policy to make sure they rounded up, at minimum, a sample from every community. This, combined with those released in the early going went back to their communities and discussed things that happened there, all seem to have done a bang-up job of instilling fear in the populace as intended. In fact, there were even little jingles about these places, such as this one from 1935 translated. "Dear God, make me dumb," as in silent, "that I may not to Dachau come." As Captain America's Dr. Abraham Erskine so sagely put, so many people forget that the first country that the Nazis invaded was their own. Or as one real-life contemporary German would state when interviewed, "You Americans can hardly understand the conditions under which we were living. It was as if all of Germany were a concentration camp and we were occupied by a foreign power. We were unable to do anything to oppose them. What could one person do against that powerful organization?" That said, though the Nazis did have an iron grip on the country at this point thanks to the coup and general support of the military, among others, they still needed some semblance of public support. And thus, simultaneous to all of this, the propaganda machine began doing its thing to help sway people to the side of Nazi ideology through various methods, including, of course, vilifying various groups, like most famously Jewish people, while also beginning to sow the seeds for the need for war. In particular, attempting to paint the picture that it would not be the Germans who were the aggressors in such a war, but that they were simply defending themselves. At the same time, laws to encourage the Jewish population of the nation to leave were also instituted, such as on April 1st, 1933, where there was a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. Further, April 7th of 1933 expelled all non-Aryans from civil service, and there were laws against allowing Jewish lawyers, jurors, judges, etc. On April 25th, 1933, they restricted Jewish enrollment in German high schools to 1.5%, and perhaps most famously, in 1935, the Nuremberg laws became a thing. The list goes on, and all of this, everybody was well aware of. On top of this, the night of the broken glass and the aftermath was widely reported on in Germany and beyond. This occurred on the night of November 9th, 1938, and into the morning of the next day. On this one, in a nutshell, the Nazis coordinated a widespread wave of aggression against the Jews. The idea was to make it look like the general public was just fed up with the Jews and they were acting on it, when in fact orders from the top came down that the SS, SA, and even the Hitler Youth were to basically riot around Jewish communities. In the end, hundreds of synagogues were burned and vandalized, with countless Jewish-owned businesses and homes suffering the same fate. All the while, firefighters and police were instructed to stand aside and let it happen. Doubling down on the awful, the next day approximately 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to places like the Dachau concentration camp. The general point of it all seems to have been in line with simply trying to convince the Jews to leave the country in various brutal ways. On this one, those arrested whose families could show proof that they would be leaving the country soon seem to have been released without issue. On top of the extreme oppression of the Jewish people being common knowledge, the eventual euthanasia program against certain groups, like the so-called feeble-minded, was also well known once it was instituted. Illustrating both, we have the heroic tale of priest Bernhard Lichtenberg, who very publicly prayed for the Jews of the nation daily with his congregation, as well as openly protesting both their treatment and the Nazi euthanasia programs. Despite countless warnings that if he continued his very public denouncement of the Nazis and their actions, there would be severe consequences, he ignored this completely, and even in 1941 wrote a letter to the Minister of Public Health, Leonardo Conti, stating, "I, as a human being, a Christian, a priest, and a German, demand of you, Chief Physician of the Reich, that you answer for the crimes that have been perpetrated at your bidding and with your consent, and which will call forth the vengeance of the Lord on the heads of the German people." Unfortunately for Lichtenberg, very shortly after this, he was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. As for his sentencing, he requested that he be sent off with the Jews to the east in the hope that he could provide some comfort for them there, but this request was denied, and he was instead sent to the Dachau concentration camp, where he contracted pneumonia and died in 1943. But again, up to this point, it would seem everyone had a very good idea of what was happening to the Jews and political dissidents of the nation, given the Nazis weren't exactly being subtle about any of it. In fact, in 1938, Time magazine named Hitler Man of the Year precisely because of this. Now, contrary to what is sometimes inferred from this was not to honour him, but quite the opposite. They stated, "Lesser men of the year seemed small indeed beside the Führer. Germany's 700,000 Jews have been tortured physically, robbed of homes and properties, denied a chance to earn a living, chased off the streets. Now they are being held for ransom, a gangster trick through the ages." They ended their article on the decision to name Hitler the Man of the Year on the ominous note, "To those who watched the closing events of the year, it seemed more than probable that the man of 1938 may make 1939 a year to be remembered." Time certainly nailed that one. Again, it's important to emphasize here that while there were certainly a lot of brutal and unjust deaths happening up to this point, along with all the other injustices, the overall plan with regards to the Jews seems to have been to run them out of any German-occupied nation. Unfortunately for the Jewish people, despite everyone pretty much being well aware of this, not just Germans, but the world on the whole seemed to be bothered to do very little about this. And as we'll get into shortly, even when the opportunity was there to help in the way the Nazis wanted as well, namely sending the Jews off to other countries, quite literally almost every nation the world over collectively said, "Yeah, no thanks," even knowing what was going on in Germany at the time. Although perhaps this shouldn't be so much of a surprise, given that even today this collective not my problem attitude with regards to accepting persecuted refugees from troubled nations is still very much a relatively common thing the world over. But as for this specific case, not helping the matter was that rampant anti-Semitism was hardly unique to Germany at the time, and not just that, but the general support for eugenics programs in some form was likewise pretty widespread the world over. For example, around this time, eugenicists in the US and elsewhere in the world were performing forced sterilization of the poor, sick, criminals, prostitutes, as well as forced abortions of pregnant women of ill repute or seen as inferior based on certain traits. Even the likes of Teddy Roosevelt, arguably one of the greatest humans to ever human, was in support of eugenics. For him, however, it had nothing to do with race. In fact, he was also unabashedly outspoken against people who judge people based on their race. For example, after being widely vilified for inviting Booker T. Washington to have dinner with him at the White House, Roosevelt's response to the extreme outcry, which included death threats, was simply, "I shall have him to dine as often as I please." He also said, "The only wise and honorable and Christian thing to do is to treat each black man and each white man strictly on his merits as a man, giving him no more and no less than he shows himself worthy to have." However, on the flip side, he also stated when it came to eugenics, "I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding, and when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized and feeble-minded persons forbidden from leaving offspring behind them." This stance was also supported by such famed individuals as Winston Churchill, Margaret Sanger, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, John Harvey Kellogg, and of course Adolf Hitler, among countless others. The eugenics movement was spurred on and given its name by Sir Francis Galton in 1883, inspired by Galton's half-cousin Charles Darwin's work. Over half a century later, leading up to World War II, things had evolved significantly all over the world on this front, such as famed Cornell professor and neurologist Foster Kennedy even going so far as to write in 1942, "I am in favor of euthanasia for those helpless ones who should never have been born. Nature's mistakes." He also stated that if a child reached the age of 5 and was still defective by societal views, that the defective has no future or hope of one, then I believe it is a merciful and kindly thing to relieve that defective, often tortured and convulsed, grotesque and absurd, useless and foolish and entirely undesirable, the agony of living. While the idea of murdering 5-year-olds didn't exactly catch on in the United States, in 1936 in the US, 31 of the then 48 states had various eugenics or forced sterilization laws. The Supreme Court even rang in 1927 in the case Buck and Bell concerning the forced sterilization of, to quote, "feeble-minded white women," ruling that it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for the imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kinds. Not unique to the US or Germany, most of the developed world had similar laws on the books with widespread support. That said, everyone did a collective, oh, wait a minute, thanks to the revelation that the Nazis had taken these ideas and run with them to their extreme during World War II, and after the war, public support for eugenics all but disappeared thanks to its association with Nazi Germany. But in the era of Nazi Germany itself, quite a lot of the populace of the world thought eugenics programs were a smashing idea, and anti-Semitism was likewise pretty widespread. The Nazis simply took these two ideas to their extreme and also put them together. But as for the general public of Germany, in the days leading up to and including World War I, we can both say for sure that the German people were extremely well aware of the concentration camps, despite many interviewed after the war denying knowledge of even their very existence. Further, they were also to an extent aware of some of the things that went on in those early camps, though the death camp-style concentration camps were not yet a thing before the war. And finally, they were also aware of the extreme oppression of the Jews in Germany, as were pretty much all of the rest of the world. Going back to the Nazi plan to simply get the Jews to leave, as alluded to, a big problem with this plan was that other countries weren't exactly keen about taking in a large influx of Jewish immigrants. This was also in part why relatively few German Jews fled the country. As one German Jew, Victor Klemperer, would write in his diary of his own attempt to leave, "Meeting with the immigration advisor of the Jewish community, result less than 0. You really must get out. But we see no possibility." There was also another issue here, in that for most of these Jewish people, Germany was their home. Some were even veterans of World War I and had fought and had friends and family die for their country. The Nazis weren't Germany, and many still loved their country and hoped for change. As Klemperer would write in 1942, I am German and still waiting for the Germans to come back. They've gone to ground somewhere. Although ultimately he did despair, no one can take my Germanness away from me, but my nationalism and patriotism are gone forever. Going back to the immigration problem, the United States, despite its surface level supposed give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free thing, and the extreme success the US once had with more open immigration policies being a boon to the country, at this point they had a hard limit of 153,744 immigrants annually. This, in turn, was divided by country, with an awful lot of entry requirements to qualify on top of that. These requirements were so strict that many quotas during this time weren't filled at all, despite massively more applicants than that number. On top of that, despite news of the atrocities being committed against the Jews leading up to the war, the majority of the public opposed relaxing immigration guidelines or boosting the numbers to accommodate those desperately wanting out of Germany. Other countries more or less mimicked this general stance, with Britain even going further by taking steps to try and limit the number of German Jews who would be allowed to immigrate to Palestine, which was one place that was taking a relatively large number of Jewish immigrants compared to most states. That said, in 1938, Britain did agree to amend policy to take in 10,000 Jewish children, but made no special provisions for taking any Jewish adults outside of the already established normal immigration procedures. So the problem was, the Nazis wanted the Jews to leave, and this was part of their original master plan. Further, as a result of Nazi actions and new laws, many Jews desperately wanted to leave, but most couldn't, because they had nowhere to go. That said, even if genocide wasn't maybe the original plan, it wasn't as if the idea of mass murder wasn't occasionally being proposed, even quite publicly, by the Nazis in power. Perhaps most pertinent to the topic at hand, in a speech in January of 1939, Hitler even went so far as to predict it. Today, I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Apparently, the Nazis being the ones to cause a Second World War wasn't a problem, though we guess it should also be pointed out here that this was not the only time Hitler very publicly telegraphed his prediction of the Holocaust should another world war break out. Of course, even with all of the propaganda and anti-Semitism, hating a culture or race or the like is one thing, but getting people to go along with mass murder of them, including children, is quite another, let alone getting the German public to go along with the idea of another major war so soon after a devastating one like World War I, which again saw over 2 million Germans dead, among an awful lot of other horribleness during and in the aftermath. Needless to say, the Nazis had a lot of creative storytelling to do. As such, first the Nazis did their utmost to convince everyone that the German brass were all about peace, but also made it clear they had a responsibility to protect Germans and thus needed to take up arms in order to protect the peace. As things progressed, they further pushed hard for the fact that they needed to defend against supposedly aggressive Poland, who were, according to them, mistreating ethnic Germans in that country. And not only that, they stated Poland was being extremely aggressive against Germany itself, flagrantly attacking, even though it turns out the truth of several cited events of Polish aggressions against Germany were actually Nazi SS dressed as Polish soldiers. Perhaps the most famous of these attacks was on a German radio station the day before Hitler announced Germany would now retaliate because of these attacks, all as a defensive action. Once Germany actually invaded Poland, the German press were also instructed to not reference this as a war, nor even Germany invading Poland, but rather simply Germany repelling Polish attacks. They were further trying to ensure that it would be other nations, like Britain and France, who would be the ones to declare war first against Germany, which they did a couple of days later, and thus, once again, Germany was simply defending itself against other nations declaring war against them. As a discussion for the comments below, up to this point, would the Nazis and Hitler have been more or less able to get away with convincing Germans of all of this if they'd had the internet? On the one hand, more than ever, we all have access to hard and provable data. On the other hand, the spread of misinformation is perhaps greater than ever. Let us know your thoughts. In any event, directly after Germany invaded Poland, the Nazi propaganda machine further inflamed the German people, citing nearly 60,000 ethnic Germans supposedly slaughtered by the Polish directly after. In truth, there was a mass slaughter of ethnic Germans in the country in response to the invasion, but the number was about 10 times smaller than the German media reported. Speaking of mass murder, while countless thousands of Jews were murdered either directly or via maltreatment prior to the more concerted implementation of the final solution, this more systematic mass murder didn't begin until around 1941, when decisions were likewise being made with regards to war with the Soviet Union, as we'll get to shortly. That said, when Poland was invaded, the Germans did round up thousands of Jewish Poles along with a pretty amazingly large number of other Poles and summarily shot them and threw them into mass graves. Around the same time, now finally having a place to put the rest of the Jews, they began deporting them to the newly invaded country and elsewhere as the Nazis spread across Europe. As to what the general public thought about these deportations, it was generally stated that the mass roundup of the Jewish people would simply see them resettled and used for labor purposes. As anti-Semitism was at its zenith, few seem to have had a huge problem with this. Although it should be noted again that publicly speaking out against all of this wasn't exactly a great way to make it so you didn't join them, so that no doubt also contributed to the lack of outcry. Of course, the Nazi brass were aware that the Labour Front story had some plot holes in it. You see, they were also unabashedly rounding up elderly and disabled Jews who were unlikely to be very helpful towards these ends. To get around the logical problem, the propaganda machine spun a tale that those unable to work, like the elderly, were being sent to residential communities where they would live out their days in peace. Once it was established in 1941, the brass publicising the existence of the Theresienstadt ghetto, which did, in fact, house a lot of elderly Jews, but conditions were intentionally made so bad that the populace would be sure to not take too long dying. In fact, over 30,000 of its residents are known to have died there, despite it not technically being a death camp. On top of that, what they didn't mention was that Theresienstadt eventually also served as a way station of sorts to the death camps. Speaking of Theresienstadt and the propaganda machine, in 1944, after hundreds of Danish Jews were deported there the year before, the Danish Red Cross and the International Red Cross were successfully able to convince the Nazis that they should be allowed to come inspect the ghetto to ensure its people were actually being treated well, contrary to what the world press were reporting concerning mass extermination and countless crimes against humanity at this point. Wanting to put their money where their mouths were, the SS finally agreed to such an inspection several months after the request was made, so they had a chance to pretty up the place first. As such, before allowing such an inspection, the Nazis accelerated the deportation of Jews stashed in Theresienstadt, sending thousands off to their deaths to reduce the population density. As for the remaining populace, they were put to work renovating everything, planting gardens, repainting homes, etc. If you look at pictures from the results of all of this, the place does appear to be quite nice, and the populace that were chosen to remain for the inspection looked healthy. Of course, once the Red Cross completed their inspections, normal operations resumed. That said, to further take advantage of the apparent great conditions there, around the time of the Red Cross visit, the SS themselves made a documentary of sorts of the beautified place, including showing residents of the ghetto attending concerts, playing sports, working in their gardens, and otherwise just having a gay old time. Of course, what they failed to mention was that in order to get this footage beyond, of course, the aforementioned beautifying of the place, they also had to coerce the populace into playing their roles, using everything from threats to food to get them to cooperate. That said, the problem with the video they made here was that the life of those in the ghetto was in many ways depicted as superior to that of many of the general populace back in Germany at the time. Naturally, from this, when the SS finally completed the film, they decided not to show it to anyone, it's thought because of this reason. This is not unlike a rather funny mix-up during the Cold War, in which Stalin allowed the Grapes of Wrath under the alternate name The Road to Wrath to be viewed by the Soviet populace to depict how bad things could get under capitalism. Except the whole thing kind of backfired in that the film depicts incredibly impoverished Americans are still able to afford cars, something many in the Soviet Union just didn't have, and thus the film was quickly pulled and subsequently banned. Going back to the ghettos and trying to paint a rosier picture, another thing the Nazis did tell people from looking too closely was to spread about the idea that the Jews were all disease-ridden. They even went so far as to post quarantine signs at the entrances of ghettos, which simultaneously helped keep people away, while also explaining all of the bodies. There was just widespread disease inside, which, to be fair, thanks to the abhorrent conditions, sometimes was actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Going back to shortly after the invasion of Poland and other countries soon after, while again there certainly were an awful lot of deaths and atrocities happening, the concerted effort to systematically annihilate the Jews and various others as a central policy still wasn't yet a thing. This all changed, however, in 1941, when the final solution was agreed upon, initially via use of mass firing squads. Kicking things off in the most brutal way imaginable, we have the Kiev and Babi Yar ravine, where over 30,000 Jewish people were shot and killed in a 2-day span on September the 29th and 30th of that year. Noteworthy, upwards of 100,000 more people were also killed and dumped in the ravine as well at various points of German occupation. The original Grisly Act was described by the commander in charge, stating the difficulties resulting from such a large-scale action, in particular concerning the seizure, were overcome in Kiev by requesting the Jewish population through wall posters to move. Although only a participation of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Jews had been expected at first, more than 30,000 Jews arrived who, until the very moment of their execution, still believed in their resettlement thanks to an extremely clever organization. A truck driver who witnessed what happened next described the gut-wrenching atrocity. I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women, and children arrived. They led them past a number of different places where, one after the other, they had to give up their luggage, then their coats, shoes, and overgarments, and also underwear. They also had to leave their valuables in a designated place. There was a special pile for each article of clothing. It all happened very quickly, and anyone who hesitated was kicked or pushed to keep them moving. After that, once they undressed, they were led into the ravine, which was about 150 meters long and 30 meters wide, and a good 15 meters deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie down on top of Jews who had already been shot. The corpses were literally in layers. A police marksman came along and shot each Jew in the neck with a submachine gun. I saw these marksmen stand on layers of corpses and shoot one after the other. The marksman would walk across the bodies of the executed Jews to the next Jew, who had meanwhile lain down and shot him. Of the well over 30,000 Jews that were victims of this insanity, only 29 survived. One such, Dina Pronicheva, stated she jumped onto the bodies before being shot, then played dead while the Nazis shot at those still alive around her. Once nightfall came, they had covered many of the bodies with dirt, but there were still SS walking around shooting anyone they found alive. However, it was dark, and when an opportune moment came, she was able to crawl out from among the bodies and sneak away without being seen. Another interesting thing to point out is that the decision to start the systematic mass annihilation of the Jews followed almost immediately after the United States entered the war, thus making it a so-called world war, with Nazi politician and Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels stating, regarding the Jewish question, the Führer warned the Jews that if they were to cause another world war, it would lead to their destruction. Those were not empty words. Now the world war has come. The destruction of the Jews must be its necessary consequence. We cannot be sentimental about it. Now finally, having begun the open genocide, plans began in earnest to convert some of the concentration camps to also include designated facilities for rapid mass executions, as it was noted that the mass firing squad method was bad for troop morale and also rather inefficient on the scale they needed, as well as it wasted an awful lot of bullets. And as to that scale, from March 1942 to November 1943 alone, some 1.5 million Jews were murdered in just 3 concentration camps via gas chamber. So, what did people know about this escalation of atrocities? Almost immediately after these mass murders began, the Allies caught wind of it. While there were various sources of information the Allies had access to with regards to the mass killings in and outside of the concentration camps, our personal favourite source also just happens to be one of our favourite people to talk about here on Today I Found Out, and no, it's not Teddy Roosevelt, the undisputed greatest man to ever man, but one of the runners-up to that position, a badass individual by the name of Captain Witold Pilecki. When Pilecki wasn't busy getting the people eventually in charge of guarding and torturing him to rethink their life choices and value all life all the way down to the little ladybug, because to him all life had value, more on that in bonus facts later, he was fearlessly doing his duty for his country and the Allies, including being the first to report the use of Zyklon B in the gas chambers. So how did Pilecki know about this? This rather daring Polish man decided to infiltrate Auschwitz in the most dangerous way possible. You see, after the Nazis invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Pilecki and some like-minded friends formed the Tajna Armia Polska, the Polish secret army. Not long after the formation of organized widespread Polish resistance, its members began hearing reports of the conditions within the newly constructed Auschwitz concentration camp put into operation in the spring of 1940. Those first reports originated with prisoners released from the camp and from civilians, such as railroad employees and local residents. In order to cut through the very troubling rumours and figure out exactly what was going on there, Pilecki came up with a bold plan: become a prisoner at Auschwitz. With a little convincing, his superiors eventually agreed to allow him to try. According to Eleonora Ostrowska, owner of an apartment Pilecki was at when he was taken, when a Nazi roundup began, where a city block would suddenly be closed off and most civilians inside would be rounded up and sent to a slave labour camp and sometimes even just max executed on the spot, a member of the resistance came to help Pilecki hide. Instead, Ostrowska said, Witold rejected these opportunities and didn't even try to hide in my flat. She reported that soon a German soldier knocked at the door and Poletsky whispered to her, "Report that I have fulfilled the order," and then opened the door and was taken by the soldier along with about 2,000 other Poles in Warsaw on September the 19th, 1940. It is at this point that we feel compelled to point out that he didn't really know if he'd be sent to Auschwitz. As Dr. Daniel Palawoda noted of Poletsky's capture, since the AB Action and roundups were still going on, the Nazis could have tortured and executed him in occupied Warsaw's Pawiak Mokotów or any other Gestapo-run prison. They could have taken him to Palmary to murder him in the forest. At the very least, they could have sent him to a forced labor colony somewhere in Germany. While he was willingly surrendering with the hope of being sent to Auschwitz, Poletsky lamented the behavior of his fellow countrymen during the roundup. He stated, "What really annoyed me the most was the passivity of this group of Poles. All those picked up were already showing signs of crowd psychology, the result being that our crowd behaved like a herd of passive sheep. A simple thought kept nagging me. Stir up everyone and get this mass of people moving." As he had hoped, perhaps the only person to ever hope such a thing, he was later sent to Auschwitz. He later described his experience upon arrival as such. "We gave everything away into bags, to which respective numbers were tied. Here our hair of head and body were cut off, and we were slightly sprinkled by cold water. I got a blow in my jaw with a heavy rod. I spat out my 2 teeth. Bleeding began. From that moment, we became mere numbers. I wore the number 4859. We were struck over the head not only by SS rifle butts, but by something far greater. Our concepts of law and order and of what was normal, all those ideas to which we had become accustomed on this earth, were given a brutal kicking." Poletsky also stated that one of the first indications he observed that Auschwitz was not just a normal prison camp was the lack of food given to prisoners. In his estimate, the rations given to prisoners were calculated in such a way that people would live for 6 weeks. He also noted that a guard at the camp told him, "Whoever will live longer, it means he steals." Assessing the conditions inside Auschwitz was only part of Poletsky's mission. He also took on responsibility for organizing a resistance force within the camp, the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, or ZOW, and I apologize for my pronunciation. The goal of ZOW included improving inmate morale, distributing any extra food and clothing, setting up an intelligence network within the camp, training prisoners to eventually rise up against their guards and liberate Auschwitz, and getting news in and out of Auschwitz. Ensuring secrecy of the ZOW led Poletsky to create cells within the organization. He trusted the leaders of each cell to withstand interrogation by the guards, but even so, each leader only knew the names of the handful of people under his command. This limited the risk to the entire organization should an informant tip off a guard or if a member was caught. Going back to the topic at hand, Poletsky's first reports to the Polish government and Allied forces about the conditions in the camp and atrocities occurring there left the camp with released prisoners. But when releases became less common, passing reports onto the outside world depended largely on the success of prisoner escapes, such as one that occurred on June the 20th, 1942, when 4 Poles managed to dress up as members of the SS, weapons and all, and steal an SS car, which they boldly drove out of the main gate of the camp. A cobbled-together radio, built over the course of 7 months as parts could be acquired, was used for a while in 1942 to transmit reports, until, he said, one of our fellows' big mouth resulted in the Nazis learning of the radio, forcing the group to dismantle it before they were caught red-handed and executed. As alluded to, Poletsky's reports were the first to mention the use of Zyklon B gas, a poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas, and gas chambers used at the camp. He saw the first use of Zyklon B gas in September 1941 when the Nazis used it to kill 850 Soviet POWs and Poles in Block 11 of Auschwitz I. He also learned of the gas chambers at Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, from other resistance members after construction of the camp began in October 1941. ZOW also managed to keep a pretty good running log of roughly the number of inmates being brought into the camp and the estimated number of deaths, noting at one point over 1,000 a day from the new transports were gassed. The corpses were burnt in the new crematoria. All of the reports were sent to the Polish government in exile in London, and they in turn forwarded the information to other Allied forces. However, extremely important to the topic at hand, despite direct evidence and eyewitness accounts, on the whole, it seems, in the early stages at least, the Allies thought the reports of mass killings, starvation, brutal and systematic torture, gas chambers, medical experimentation, etc. were wildly exaggerated and initially questioned the reliability of Poletsky's reports. Nevertheless, Poletsky soldiered on and even managed to convince his network of resistance fighters inside the camp that they could successfully take control for a short while and escape if the Allies and Polish underground provided support. He had envisioned airdrops of weapons and possibly even Allied soldiers invading the camp. However, the Allies never had any intention of such an operation, and the local Polish resistance in Warsaw refused to attack due to the large number of German troops stationed nearby. Unfortunately, the Nazi guards began systematically eliminating members of the ZOW resistance in 1943, and so, with his reports being seemingly ignored, Pilecki decided he needed to plead his case in person for intervention in Auschwitz. Thus, being seemingly one of the most badass people to ever badass, he simply resolved to leave the camp. And so it was that in April of 1943, he handed over leadership of ZOW to his top deputies and looked for his opportunity to escape. It came when he and 2 others were assigned the night shift at a bakery which was located outside the camp's perimeter fence. At an opportune moment on the night of the 26th, they managed to overpower a guard and cut the phone lines. The 3 men then made a run for it out of the back of the bakery. As they ran, Pilecki stated, "Shots were fired behind us. How fast we were running, it is hard to describe. We were tearing the air into rags by the quick movements of our hands." It should be noted that anyone caught helping an Auschwitz escapee would be killed along with the escaped prisoner, something the local populace knew well. Further, the 40 square kilometers around Auschwitz were extremely heavily patrolled, and the escapees' shaved heads, tattered clothes, and gaunt appearance would give them away in a second to anyone who saw them. Despite this, all 3 not only survived the initial escape, but managed to get to safety without being recaptured. Unfortunately, Pilecki's plan to garner support for liberating Auschwitz never materialized. After arriving at the headquarters of the Home Army on August 25, 1943, and desperately pleading his case for the Home Army to put all efforts into liberating Auschwitz, he left feeling, to quote him, bitter and disappointed, and the idea was discarded as being too risky. In his final report on Auschwitz, he further vented his frustration on his superiors' cowardliness. Not only reports from the likes of frankly amazing heroes like Pilecki, the Allies also were, among many other sources, intercepting transmissions from the Germans about all manner of mass killings. Churchill summed up the gathered intelligence in a live broadcast in 1941, quote, "As Hitler's armies advance, whole districts are being exterminated. Scores of thousands, literally scores of thousands of executions in cold blood are being perpetrated by the German police troops. Since the Mongol invasions of Europe in the 16th century, there has never been methodical, merciless butchery on such a scale or approaching such a scale. And this is but the beginning. Famine and pestilence have yet to follow in the bloody ruts of Hitler's tanks. We are in the presence of a crime without a name." Outside of such speeches as this, there are literally thousands upon thousands of known news reports in the Allied world discussing these atrocities in surprisingly accurate detail in some cases, with headlines like from the London Times, "Massacre of Jews, over 1 million dead since war began," or the Montreal Daily Star with the article, "Nazi Slaughterhouse, Germans Massacre Million Jews in Extermination Drive." Edward Murrow of CBS Radio on December 13th, 1942, reported very frankly, "What is happening is this. Millions of human beings, most of them Jews, are being gathered up with ruthless efficiency and murdered. The phrase concentration camps is obsolete, as out of date as economic sanctions or non-recognition. It is now possible only to speak of extermination camps." Summing it up with remarkable accuracy, in late 1942, the US, Soviet Union, and Britain all released a joint statement that read, "Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe. In Poland, which has been made the principal Nazi slaughterhouse, the ghettos established by the German invaders are being systematically emptied of all Jews except a few highly skilled workers required for war industries. None of those taken away are ever heard of again. The able-bodied are slowly worked to death in labor camps. The infirm are left to die of exposure and starvation, or are deliberately massacred in mass executions. The number of victims of these bloody cruelties is reckoned in many hundreds of thousands of entirely innocent men, women, and children." Needless to say, the Allied world was well aware of what was happening. That said, it should be noted that World War I propaganda reports by Allied brass included an awful lot of atrocities that turned out to be exaggerated or not true at all after the fact, so people, even in Allied lands, were initially skeptical despite the evidence and reports that were presented. Going back to Germany, the tightly controlled German media were unsurprisingly prevented from discussing the various massacres so openly, with the Nazi Party themselves largely both denying all of this, and with regards to the Jews, denying the poor living conditions within ghettos and concentration camps as previously noted. That said, given the German media and Nazi brass seemed to often feel the need to counter rumours publicly, it would at least seem the case that the rumours were out there fairly prominently. On that note, listening to illegal broadcasts from Allied sources within Germany and German-controlled regions was a thing, as were at times reading dropped Allied leaflets and the like. Not just that, it's pointed out by history professor Dr. Connell Feigs that exterminating that many people wasn't exactly something that could be done without an insane amount of support staff on various levels knowing about it, stating, "The task was so enormous, complex, time-consuming, and mentally and economically demanding that it took the best efforts of millions of Germans. All spheres of life in Germany actively participated. Businessmen, policemen, bankers, doctors, lawyers, soldiers, railroad and factory workers, chemists, pharmacists, foremen, production managers, economists, manufacturers, jewelers, diplomats, civil servants, propagandists, filmmakers and film stars, professors, teachers, politicians, mayors, party members, construction experts, art dealers, architects, landlords, janitors, truck drivers, clerks, industrialists, scientists, generals, and even shopkeepers. All were essentially cogs in the machinery that accomplished the final solution." Going back to illegal broadcasts, as the war progressed and Germany began to suffer some rather catastrophic defeats, the Nazis began to have a much more difficult time satisfactorily explaining away events to favour Germany. And, for example, after the Germans were trounced in Stalingrad in February 1943, the dissonance between official news stories and what was being reported by the German media seemed to result in more and more Germans beginning to reject the state propaganda and turn to foreign radio broadcasts instead in order to learn what was really going on. Foreign broadcasts, again, that were quite openly discussing the countless atrocities. That said, as was happening to an extent in Allied lands, even among those among the German populace who were listening to the broadcast and otherwise heard the seemingly pretty rampant rumours about all of this, there seems to have been a great deal of scepticism. After all, it's not like the German people were stupid when it came to their own government's propaganda machine. It would seem many were well aware that they were being fed lies on a number of fronts from the Nazis. So it was, thus, not a stretch that the other side might come up with their own set of lies, making the Nazis and Germany out to be committing unspeakable acts. This sort of propaganda, again, wasn't that uncommon on both sides in the last World War, which was still relatively fresh on everybody's minds. That said, from various journal entries and the like, we do at least know some Germans who weren't directly involved were convinced, though they were powerless to do anything about it. For example, we have the case of one Friedrich Kellner, a staunch and, in the early days at least, very publicly outspoken opponent of the Nazi Party, which got him on the brutal end of more than one beating. As events progressed, he finally accepted there was nothing much he could, from a practical standpoint, do about any of it. Although he still wasn't exactly quiet about the things he found out, ultimately making him a target of the Nazis, with one Nazi official, Ernst Monig, writing a report about Kellner's actions which read, "He should be made to disappear." Nevertheless, Kellner was not killed, and instead wrote, "I could not fight the Nazis in the present, as they had the power to still my voice, so I decided to fight them in the future." Thus, he took to doing his best to document the Nazi atrocities and methods of getting the public to support them or otherwise allow things to happen. The summation of his work was in the form of his journal titled My Opposition. Noteworthy to the discussion at hand, many historians who advocate that the German populace knew a lot more than seemed to be the case after the war point out that much of Kellner's information came from publicly available sources such as Nazi broadcasts, hundreds of newspaper clippings, and talking to various community members around him, as well as listening to illegal Allied broadcasts and the like. Basically, there was nothing much special about Kellner or the information he had access to. On this note, Kellner had some rather harsh words for his fellow Germans, stating, "There is no punishment that would be hard enough to be applied to these Nazi beasts. Of course, when the retribution comes, the innocent will have to suffer along with them. But because 99% of the German population is guilty, directly or indirectly, for the present situation, we can only say that those who travel together will hang together." Of the atrocities committed he was aware of, these included the so-called mercy killings of various Germans, as well as countless mass murders against civilians, both domestically and abroad in occupied territories. For example, he documented the execution of about 100 French civilians in retaliation for 2 German officers being killed, stating, "To let people who are completely innocent suffer for the deeds of another is reminiscent of the horrific deeds of wild beasts in times long ago." As for the slaughter of Jews, he states, among other evidence he collected, a soldier on leave here said he personally witnessed a terrible atrocity in the occupied part of Poland. He watched as naked Jewish men and women were placed in front of a long, deep ditch, and upon the order of the SS, were shot by Ukrainians in the back of their heads, and they fell into the ditch. Then the ditch was filled in as screams kept coming from it. He also elaborates, this cruel, despicable, and sadistic treatment against the Jews that has lasted now several years, with its final goal of extermination, is the biggest stain on the honour of Germany. They will never be able to erase these crimes. Noteworthy here is that he was already documenting these atrocities in 1941 before the more mass implementation of the so-called final solution. To help spread the word beyond openly discussing these things with those around, he would also rather bravely do things like gathering dropped Allied leaflets and placing them around his town so the maximum number of people would be exposed to them. His grandson, English professor Robert Scott Kellner, would state of his grandfather's work, Friedrich knew that people like the Nazis would never lose their thirst for power and absolute rule. The last of the Holocaust survivors will soon depart, but his voice will remain. A voice to check revisionist historians and Holocaust deniers with an irrefutable account. An account not by a Nazi or a victim of the Nazis, but by an average German citizen. That said, while he was more or less an average German citizen, he was one who actively sought information about what the Nazis were up to from any source that he could find, piecing together everything from there to try and discern the truth. So what about everyone else? Again, historians are in disagreement as to the extent of the wider public's knowledge about what was going on. This is despite countless surviving journals showing that at least some people were very aware or at least suspected what was going on, not to mention the innumerable number of people directly involved on some level and their relations. Not to mention, again, people seeming to have had at least some level of access to the needed information. So what about the other side of the argument? On the side that it maybe wasn't totally common knowledge, besides many after the fact claiming that they didn't know, we have that it appears many of the Jews rounded up weren't under the impression they would be taken off to death camps or the like. The general perception seems to be that they knew they were going into a really bad situation with the very real possibility of dying, but that they didn't think they were being mass murdered, just extremely mistreated. The Nazi regime helped foster this notion in a variety of ways. For example, in 1941, a booklet printed by the Nazi brass for widespread consumption outlined how Jews in places like Poland had been given work, access to hospitals, food, and those who needed it even provided with vocational training. More directly, they reassured the Jews rounded up and in the ghettos that the deported from these points were being sent to places with better conditions. To help corroborate this, upon arrival into the concentration camps, many inmates were forced to write letters about the good condition in the camps. On this note, even in the ghettos themselves, there seems to have been a lot of skepticism about the final solution. The issue primarily seems to just go back to, once again, despite all the evidence slapping everybody in the face, many just refused to believe their fellow human beings could actually be doing this, and it wasn't just some sort of propaganda campaign from the other side. As one of the leaders of the Jewish resistance in Warsaw, Yitzhak Zuckerman, noted, common sense could not understand that it was possible to exterminate tens and hundreds of thousands of Jews. Of course, as Allied troops began liberating countries and their concentration camps as they marched toward Germany, things eventually changed. But before it did, the Allied soldiers almost universally would later write of their exasperation at the apparent widespread accounts from Germans themselves that they had been totally ignorant of any of these atrocities. For example, William Ward of the 232nd Infantry stated, all of the locals were adamant that they were nicht Nazi and didn't have any idea what had taken place at the concentration camp. Another by the name of Arthur Johnson stated, all these people who claimed they didn't know anything about it, and they were just 10 or 15 miles from Weimar, Buchenwald concentration camp. Noteworthy on this one, to counter previous Allied reports about atrocities there, Nazi propaganda had stated all the bodies were from mass burial of air raid victims. In this case, both showing a plausible alternate story, as well as also demonstrating that the news was out there for the German public to the extent that the Nazis felt like they needed to address the topic. In the end, while the matter is still hotly contested, the general consensus is that it is clear a considerable number of people beyond those directly involved did have access to the needed information to know what was going on. But not just largely apparently unwilling to believe it, even when directly told after the war, resistance to the idea seems to have still been a thing throughout the world, at least at first. In short, for a world on both sides used to pretty rampant and often blatantly false propaganda, when it came to World War I and a German populace quite familiar with a whole lot of BS coming from their own government on the propaganda front, it was perhaps difficult to know what to believe, especially when the atrocities were so insane in their reported degree. On top of this, for many Germans peripherally complicit in these acts and under Nazi rule with little else they could do about it, many perhaps simply didn't want to believe that it was true, even when exposed to the necessary information. As one contemporary German housewife noted, Of course, there were rumours about the camps, but no one believed them. We thought that the prisoners might be working hard, that they might not be getting plenty of good food, and we even imagined some beatings or making the prisoners shout in chorus, Heil Hitler. Of course, once direct evidence in the form of pictures and videos and survivor accounts and the like flooded the newsways the world over, skeptics throughout the world, for the most part, finally came to accept the truth. As a result of this, and how harsh the Nazis had been against their own people after they came to power, after the war a relatively unique thing happened in Germany that you don't often see in the history books. A defeated people really didn't see themselves that way, nor their former enemy as their enemy. Rather, the general public, and the way the history books largely write about it in Germany, saw the Allies as also having liberated Germany from the Nazis. In fact, in Germany, the major destruction in the country and the high cost of human lives during the war is not generally attributed to the Allies' actions, but rather to the Nazi regime itself. Thus, somewhat unique in history, the opposing forces who were victorious are not generally seen in a negative light by those they defeated. Far from it. On that note, the occupation of the German cities by the Allied army is characterized as liberation, Befreiung, despite, of course, that the Allied soldiers at the time didn't seemingly view the race to Berlin as a race to free Berlin. Fast forwarding to today and how World War II is taught in German schools, we've actually covered that in full in another video. But briefly, a major emphasis in the German education system is placed on studying the build-up to the Nazis and their actions after they came to power, with the students confronted with the crushing effects of totalitarian regimes, racial ideologies, and where these can lead. In addition to photo and video documentaries, most schools organise mandatory school trips to Holocaust memorials, usually former concentration camps. With all this emphasis towards the end of making sure nothing like that ever happens again in Germany and beyond. In contrast, the details of the fields of war are often underplayed in German schools. A possible reason for this is that showing maps of expanding German territory during the first 2 years of the war and discussing their winning battles might cause encouragement of nationalistic pride, which seems counterproductive to many given the points that the educators are trying to teach. At first glance, it is great to study these events in detail to make sure they don't happen again. However, an issue for Germans, of course, is the sense of collective responsibility, despite no student today, or their parents, or even potentially grandparents, having anything to do with anything that happened in World War II. We see this not just in the case of Germany and World War II, but often in other atrocities of the past the world over, with blame sometimes being assigned to people living today, occasionally many generations away from anyone who had anything to do with it. How much weight does the idea of original sin have? How is a person born in the 2000s responsible for the Nazi atrocities? It is still heavily frowned upon to display the modern-day German flag, despite officially and explicitly not being a Nazi symbol in most contexts other than international football matches. On a similar note, a nationalistic display such as pledging allegiance to the flag during class every morning would have the worst possible connotations in Germany, despite being commonplace in the United States. Furthermore, there's a high percentage of the population with immigrant heritage. As you might expect from all this, there is some concern that the German school systems today might be going too far with the seeming obsession with the Nazis and all the mistakes that were made, instead of spending more time on broader history, as is more typical in other nations. Whatever one's own opinion on that, as an interesting little side note, the German denazification process was considered such a success that decades later, Americans sought to apply a similar methodology after occupying Iraq. Unsurprisingly, that wasn't exactly successful. Bonus fact. Going back to the badass that was Captain Witold Pilecki, you might think it's strange that Pilecki frequently, quite willingly, threw himself into incredibly dangerous situations, not just given he seemed to have little concern for his own self-preservation, but also that he had a wife and kids back home. Polish actor Marek Probos, who studied Pilecki extensively before portraying him in The Death of Captain Pilecki, stated of this, "Human beings were the most precious thing for Pilecki, and especially those who were oppressed. He would do anything to liberate them, to help them." Mirroring the sentiment, Pilecki's son, Andrzej, later said his father would write that we should live worthwhile lives, to respect others and nature. He wrote to my sister to watch out for every little ladybug, to not step on it, but place it instead on a leaf, because everything has been created for a reason. Love nature. He instructed us like this in his letters. Regarding the reception of World War II, especially within the educational system of countries that participated in the war, one would expect that many broad facts are common knowledge, and as happens with most all wars in history, each nation biases things a little bit to make themselves look better in their own history books, regardless of what actually happens. As we recently covered, however, the Germans in World War II are a rather interesting exception to this rule. You can see our video, How Did the Germans Teach About World War II, for more on that, obviously. This brings us to a top voted question from that video. How does one of Germany's chief allies in that war, Japan, teach about World War II and their country's part in that historic conflict? This is seemingly asked as, while perhaps not to the scale of Germany, the Japanese military was notorious for its behavior as an occupying army and its extreme use of force, leading to enslavement of parts of populations and widespread massacres. The scars this period left in the formerly occupied countries are felt to this very day, not only in the history books but also in works of art and literature such as Dragon's Seed by Pearl S. Bach. More specifically, these war crimes resulted in the deaths of between 3 and 14 million people and include systematic extermination, such as the massacre at Nanjing in late 1937-1938. At the time, Nanjing was the capital of China, and the death toll is estimated at between 50 and 300,000 people. Sometimes specific groups were targeted, such as the Hui people. Furthermore, virtual enslavement of people took place as laborers or in forced prostitution. For example, the use of sex slaves, known as comfort women, was systematic and widespread in Korea, China, Thailand, and many other countries under the yoke of the Japanese at the time. Additionally, captors were used for experimentation. Most notorious is Unit 731, a military unit established by an imperial order that conducted experiments on civilians. Building from the ashes, literally, of a previous program, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731 for short, was authorized in 1936. Bases were established at various places in China, including at Pinfang and Hishiking. Referring to their victims as maruta, meaning logs, the researchers experimented on apparently anyone they could get their hands on: Chinese, Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, Pacific Islanders, other Southeast Asians, and even a few American prisoners of war, all fell victim to the doctors at the camps. Taking the scientific method to new lows, the researchers in Unit 731 conducted a variety of experiments. For example, effects of lethal doses. Victims were purposefully infected with fatal, contagious diseases like the bubonic plague, so researchers could learn exactly how the diseases affected the human body. Because they feared that decomposition, which begins immediately once a person dies, might corrupt tissues, they dissected their victims alive. Likewise, because they were worried that drugs might blemish their findings, the victims were given no anesthetic. Rather, they were vivisected while fully conscious of what was happening. Next up, we have limb amputation. The scientists wanted to learn the limits of the human body and so conducted a number of tests on their victims' arms and legs. Sometimes the limbs were frozen and thawed in order to study how frostbite and gangrene developed. At other times, limbs were cut off and sewn back onto the other side of the body. In a few experiments, when the limbs were removed, researchers just observed the loss of blood. Moving on from there, many victims had all or part of their organs removed, and some even had organs detached, then reattached in unique ways nature never intended. Experiments were also conducted with high pressure, poisonous chemical exposure, centrifuges, burning, blood infusions from animals, burying, and x-rays. Of course, since the purpose of these tests was to determine how much a body could withstand, the experiments would generally continue until the test subject was dead. Given all of this, it may or may not surprise you to hear from people raised in Japan that they hardly learned 20th century Japanese history in class. For example, in a BBC report from 2013, it is noted that one major Japanese school's history book contains only 19 out of 357 pages dealing with events between 1931 and 1945, with, for example, the Nanjing Massacre occupying only one line. As historian Stephen E. Ambrose wrote, the Japanese presentation of the war to its children runs something like this. One day, for no reason we ever understood, the Americans started dropping atomic bombs on us. But is this actually an accurate summation, or is it simply cherry-picked by the victors? To really dive into it, it's necessary to understand a little bit about the school systems of Japan. It turns out what you learn as a student in Japan can be directly related to which school you attend, but also in which decade you were born. In Japan, unlike, say, most EU countries, the books used in schools are issued by private companies instead of a central authority. The Ministry of Education's role is limited to the approval of the various books. Subsequently, each school district can then choose the book from the list of approved material. This system was initially thought of as a beneficiary step in the aftermath of the World War, as it represented one aspect of spreading American capitalistic views of privatization in Japan. It also, at least on the surface, prevented the interference of the political system in education, which at the time seemed like a good idea since this political system was born and raised within the recently defeated Japanese Empire. However, as previously alluded, the government still has a say in the process, since a special board within the Ministry of Education carries the task of approving the content of the textbooks before making them available on the book list. At this step, it has used its power to reject drafts for reasons that are seen as controversial. Allegedly, simply mentioning wrongdoings committed by the Japanese Empire before 1945 has, in some instances, constituted enough reason for exclusion from the school textbook lists. These cases are found not just in the 1950s, but also in the 2000s. An important note is it is not the mere mention of massacres, such as Nanjing, that could cause the exclusion of a book, but the use of negative tone regarding the way the Japanese Empire acted in general at the time. So, although the government is not officially denying the crimes, it does not seem to actively discourage the wave of war crime deniers, even from members of the parliament. This seems an odd choice, especially when compared to other defeated nations of the same war, such as Germany, where, as in 17 other European countries, denying the Holocaust is explicitly against the law. Furthermore, in the education system of these countries, the war crimes are dealt with in excruciating detail, and not only in history class, but extending to almost all other subjects, maybe only maths and physics aside. As for directly after the war, unlike the Nazi regime in Germany or the fascist administration in Italy, the defeated leadership of Japan could not be used as an easily isolated political scapegoat to attribute all of the nation's crimes to. In fact, the leadership of Japan did not seem to change as dramatically as in other Axis countries after the war. The figurehead of the Emperor Hirohito, for example, remained in place, although deprived of many of his powers and abdicating his godhood. The result is that the newly formed democracy had many links to a period which the Japanese wanted, and perhaps still want, to be proud of. In contrast to the European Axis powers, the Japanese Empire did not have a predecessor which could be used as a basis for a new or re-established system of government. Furthermore, although the US forces occupying Japan under General MacArthur between 1945 and 1952 led many accused war criminals to military tribunals, many of the high-ranking officials allegedly guilty of war crimes actually escaped judgment. That said, after the war, the Japanese officially issued many apologies and reached settlements with former colonized countries such as South Korea in 1965, but at the same time, as mentioned, the generations raised after the war tended to learn very little of the atrocities committed during the war. One of the many reasons for this was the entanglement of the Cold War policy with that teaching history. In July 1955, 2 years after the end of the War of Korea, textbooks containing the atrocities of the Japanese army were condemned by the Japanese parliament. The stated reason for this was that the textbooks should not aid in presenting the now communist countries in a favorable light. The invasion of China and the occupation of Manchuria were to be omitted when possible. Textbooks explicitly dealing with Japanese wrongdoings against countries that used the war as a way to attack the capitalist Japanese and therefore enforce policies that could be seen as communist were characterized as red textbooks within the rising Cold War tensions. The new requirement formed was that the wars Japan was involved in during the 30s and 40s were not to be criticized. This movement escalated, causing the banning of more than a quarter of the books used in schools at that time. One solution to avoid the ban was for authors to skip this period entirely or focus on it only in a very summarizing way. So it's not surprising that history books would have more pages regarding the Pleistocene epoch than the Pacific War. Moreover, the entanglement with Cold War policies might explain why the Americans were okay with this and didn't really push for anything different in the aftermath of the war. Going forward in time, the Cold War would not remain the major factor behind this view towards history. And indeed, in many cases, Japanese citizens would seek out learning opportunities about the war, despite the dark aspects of their country's past, if not always through school itself, then by other means such as exposure to Western media. But nevertheless, the controversies have not ceased, in large part due to the rise of nationalism on both sides. As you might imagine from this, despite this all having occurred many decades ago, when even many of our grandparents were still in diapers, the lack of a full education on these matters and the reasons behind them can cause a series of tensions. For example, Japan and South Korea. To an outside observer, the two countries, from a geopolitical and strategic view, should have been close allies. They are, broadly speaking, similar in their political institutions, commerce, and industry mentality, and face similar challenges in trade and politics, for example, with respect to North Korea, China, and Russia. Despite this, the two countries show a strong antagonism, sometimes with intentional sabotage of each other's industry, a policy which has been dubbed a trade war. The reason seems to stem in part from the tension surrounding the Japanese-Korean history, as can be clearly seen in news tabloids. Stances, as those mentioned previously, regarding denial of the war abuses are met with harsh critique, which in turn is sometimes answered. One example is the Korean Supreme Court's decision in 2012 in favor of victims or their surviving families on the issue of seeking reimbursement for work done during their enslavement that benefited Japanese industry. Such a possibility would hit many Japanese companies hard. Indeed, for Japan, any talk of monetary reparation was considered to be over following the 1965 agreement, which ended in more than $2 billion being paid to the Korean government as compensation, which in fact was an admission of guilt. Although the two countries have come to an agreement since, the tension in principle remains unresolved. In contrast, as a result of Germany and Germans taking collective responsibility for their actions during the war, their alliance with countries such as France, with whom a harmonized relationship of cooperation developed post-war, occurred relatively quickly, despite the fact that centuries-old rivalry existed even aside from the occupation during the Second World War. Would it have been so if Germany hadn't immediately chosen to take such extreme responsibility for its actions during the war? In the end, almost all nations tend to view a period in which they were the most powerful favorably. It comes as no surprise that this period of power is most often linked with some kind of military expansion, accompanied by a "we are better than the others" view, which almost inevitably leads to the feeling of national superiority, intolerance, and varied acts of cruelty, sometimes in a widespread and horrific form. In short, the abuse of the so recently gained power. Japan is not the exception, but rather the rule in this regard, as almost all nations of the world tend to follow this trend, more or less, with their own histories. On this channel, we've covered several of the daring POW breakouts of the Second World War, from the ingenious British plot to build an airplane to escape Colditz Castle to the epic saga of Lieutenant Franz von Vera, the only Axis prisoner to escape from North America back to Germany. But one country where POWs are rarely discussed is Japan. The Bushido Samurai Code, by which the Imperial Japanese forces fought, held surrender to be a shameful act, and so most servicemen fought to the death or committed suicide rather than be captured. This attitude also led the Japanese to treat Allied prisoners with a level of brutality which has become notorious. The relatively few Japanese who did surrender were mainly held in camps in Australia and New Zealand, and while breakouts were rare, those which did occur were particularly violent and suicidal, reflecting the completely different attitude of the Japanese towards captivity. The bloodiest of these took place in the early morning hours of August 5, 1944, from the Cowra camp in Australia. It was the single biggest POW breakout of the entire war. The town of Cowra lies 360 kilometres west of Sydney in the Australian state of New South Wales. Built 3 kilometres north of the town in 1941, the roughly circular Cowra POW camp held around 4,000 prisoners and was divided into 4 compounds labelled A to D. Compounds A and C held Italian enlisted men and NCOs, Compound B, Japanese enlisted men and NCOs, and Compound D, Japanese officers, as well as Koreans and Taiwanese. These compounds were divided by a pair of wide intersecting avenues known as broadways, which provided the guards with clear lines of sight and fire in case of a riot or breakout. The camp was guarded by the 22nd Garrison Battalion of the Australian Army, divided into 4 companies of around 1,000 men, each of which was responsible for guarding a different compound. Reflecting the material and manpower shortages which characterized the war, the men of the 22nd were all either too young, old, or disabled for regular military service and were equipped with obsolete weapons and equipment. These were the conditions which were to have near disastrous consequences. For the Japanese prisoners in the camp, life was a sort of existential limbo. As prisoner Masatohi Kagawa later recalled, "We had been taught that a war prisoner would be killed, but we were given no knowledge about what the life of a prisoner was like. Therefore, we thought that a man, once a prisoner, had only a hopeless future before him even after the war. We thought that most ex-prisoners returning to Japan after the war would be taken out to some deserted place like an uninhabited island and shot dead by the Japanese army. In fact, according to the war history of the Japanese of the past, no Japanese had ever been taken prisoner before. We felt that a prisoner could not hope to return to society even if he survived." Believing that once a man was captured, he ceased to be a soldier, upon arrival in the camp, the prisoners shed their uniforms and made their own clothing from blankets and linens. Many also adopted false names for fear that their families would learn of their capture, as Breakout ringleader Sergeant Major Akira Kanazawa explains. "I would never have told them my right name. The shame of being captured was too great. It would have brought dishonor to my family. We were checked, and when we learned later that American and Australian prisoners actually asked to have their names sent home so that their families would know they were alive. We could never have inflicted that on our families. We received no mail as prisoners and wanted none. We were dead men." Thus, while Allied German and Italian prisoners escaped in order to rejoin the fight and return to those families, for the Japanese, breakouts were a means of attaining the glorious death they had been denied in battle and purging themselves of the shame of surrender. The main ringleader of the August 1944 breakout was Petty Officer Hajime Toyoshima, who on February 19, 1942, had become Australia's first prisoner of war when his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was shot down during an air raid on Darwin. Like many of his fellow prisoners, Toyoshima saw no hope of returning to Japan whatever the outcome of the war, and when captured had adopted the false name of Tadao Minami. And while the camp's Italian prisoners were content to wait out the war in comfort, tensions between the guards and the Japanese remained high, and Toyoshima and his fellow prisoners quickly set about causing trouble. In 1943, many of the prisoners refused to work on May 27th, Japanese Navy Day. When confronted about this, Toyoshima warned camp guards that if he wanted the men to work, he had better bring a machine gun. The arrival of Japanese army prisoners in February 1943 brought further tensions between the prisoners themselves. By this time, Toyoshima and his fellow Navy airmen had become an elite within the camp, having learned some English and accumulated a small amount of money and possessions laboring in nearby towns. Resentment between the army and Navy prisoners led to an election being held in July 1943 to choose a new camp leader. Army Sergeant Major Akira Kanazawa was elected camp leader, with Army Sergeant Masao Kojima as his deputy and Toyoshima as third in command, though as Toyoshima was the only one of the 3 who spoke English, he remains in nominal command of the camp. Together, the new triumvirate began contemplating a possible breakout from the camp. The first signs that something was amiss came in the summer of 1944, when the normally combative Japanese prisoners suddenly became agreeable and docile. The guard's suspicions were confirmed when on June 3rd, a Korean prisoner being transferred from B to D compound reported overhearing the Japanese planning an uprising. These warnings were taken seriously by commander of B compound, Major Robert Ramsey. As such, an uprising at the Featherstone camp in New Zealand in February 1942 had resulted in 48 Japanese dead and 63 wounded, and 1 guard dead and 6 wounded. Not wanting a repeat of the Featherstone incident, Ramsey ordered security tightens. Though his request for more men was denied, he was sent 2 Vickers heavy machine guns, which were installed on trailers with searchlights outside B compound. However, these were left unmanned at night. The men of B company were also ordered to sleep with their rifles by their side, and a sentry was posted every night in the broad way between the 4 compounds. A flare signal was also arranged to warn the nearby infantry training center, whose armory Ramsey suspected would be the escaping prisoner's primary target. Yet despite these precautions, the guards were less than confident about their chances in the event of a breakout, as Major E.V. Timms, commander of C compound, lamented, "We've got to face the fact the garrison is numerically inferior. If there is a break, and they do get out, the people of Cowra could be in real danger. It's only a mile and a half away." This was compounded by the fact that B Company's population had swelled to 1,104, twice its intended capacity, and that while regular inspections for contraband were performed, no attempt was made to confiscate chisels, baseball bats, and other tools used for work and recreation, which could easily be turned into weapons. Consequently, it was decided to move 700 enlisted men and NCOs to another camp in the nearby town of Hay to deny them the leadership of their officers. On Thursday, August 3rd, 1944, 50 new guards arrived at the camp, and Kanazawa, Kojima, and Toyoshima were summoned to Major Ramsey's office and told that their men were being transferred the following Monday. Though the Australians deliberately withheld the fact that they were being split up by rank, the Japanese officers quickly deduced what was happening and that night called an emergency meeting. While the camp leadership had been contemplating a mass breakout for months, no concrete plans had been drawn up. But with time running out and under pressure from the more fanatical junior officers, Kanazawa, Kojima, and Toyoshima hastily put together a plan of action. The prisoners were divided into 3 groups, each of which was given a different objective. One would capture the Vickers machine guns and turn them on B Company headquarters. One would break out into Broadway and open the camp gates, and the third would head into open country before linking up with the others to attack the infantry training center. A call went out for all prisoners to stack firewood under their huts and collect as many blankets and baseball bats as possible to help in climbing the barbed wire. The breakout was scheduled for 2 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, August the 5th. That evening, the camp leadership went from hut to hut giving motivational speeches to their men. Many of these speeches evoked the spirit of the carp, a fish considered especially courageous in Japanese folklore. The whole thing, you must know, is more about dying than fighting. This is why it is so important for you to think tonight about the carp, its spirit, its bravery, the way it battles against onrushing currents, the way it can even swim up waterfalls. You know well the carp is the symbol of a fine Japanese boy, that the true Japanese has to be able to fight and finally die like the carp. This whole thing could go wrong. The Australians may annihilate us all tonight. You have to be dignified at the last moment, like the carp. Meanwhile, prisoners who were too ill to fight or chose not to participate in the breakout quietly committed suicide via hanging or traditional seppuku, plunging knives into their abdomens. The signal for the breakout to begin was a single bugle blast blown by Toyoshima, but at 1:45 a.m. one prisoner lost his nerve and ran screaming towards the compound gates to warn the garrison. He had already climbed the inner gates when he got stopped by warning shots fired by Private Alfred Rolls, the Broadway sentry, that night. Immediately, Lieutenant Thompson Eisbert and 2 more soldiers ran over to investigate, and then all hell broke loose. As soon as Eisbert arrived on the scene, a mob of Japanese soldiers started yelling "Banzai" and charged the fence armed with bats, chisels, knives, clubs, and garrotes. Eisbert ordered the sentries to run for their lives, and the 4 managed to make it to the gates and lock them behind them just as the mob reached the traitor and stabbed him to death. As Eisbert later recalled, "By this warning, the prisoner saved many lives, and in my opinion, the whole garrison. We had no chance to rescue him because the inner gate was still locked, and time to release him had run out. As I was the officer in charge, I shepherded the sentries and escort back to the gates, went through last, and as I turned back and looked, I saw Corporal McCormick fire at and shoot a Japanese POW brandishing some kind of weapon just behind us, right on the threshold of the gates. Meanwhile, a second group of prisoners began scaling the fences just across from the No. 2 Vickers machine gun. But they were beaten to the gun by Privates Ben Hardy and Ralph Jones, who immediately began firing into the mob, cutting down prisoners by the dozen. At one point, a stray bullet cut the power cable to the searchlight, plunging the position into darkness. But by then, the prisoners' huts were already ablaze, and Hardy and Jones could see their targets clearly against the flames. However, as the bodies piled up, it became easier for the other prisoners to scale the fence, and when it became clear that they would be overrun, Hardy told Jones to run for it and remove the bolt from the machine gun, rendering it inoperative. The 2 privates were soon overtaken and stabbed and bludgeoned to death. They would later be awarded posthumous George Crosses for their gallantry. At the same time, troops manning the No. 1 Vickers gun managed to prevent the mob from overrunning Company B headquarters, though one guard, Private Charles Shepard, was stabbed in the heart by a prisoner. Those who had escaped into the Broadway also found themselves trapped, with many crawling into the storm drains on either side of the avenue to escape the hail of fire from the guards. A third group escaped over the fence near C compound, and it is through here that most of the prisoners escaped into the open. By this time, the camp had become a scene of utter chaos, as prisoner Marakuni Takahara recalled, "I felt I could hear Toyoshima's bugle again, telling me the enemy would all be killed. There were so many people running in front of me. At the beginning of the charge, there was plenty of glare from the floodlights, then darkness, then the lights from the flare signal, red and yellow stripes across the sky, illuminating everything. The bullets from the tower were slanting down strongly like heavy rain. In the middle, many people fell down in a hail of bullets. It was hard for me to go forward because there were so many bodies. Sometimes I walked across dead bodies, sometimes I pushed the slide. At last I reached the officer's gate, but here again there were many bodies. I huddled down prone." Yet despite the suicidal ferocity of the attack, the guards soon managed to encircle and beat back the escaping prisoners, and by 3 a.m. the situation in the camp had been effectively contained. Dawn rose on a scene of absolute carnage. Of the 1,104 prisoners in B compound, 20 had committed suicide before the attack, 378 had escaped into open country, and 206 had been gunned down inside the camp, their bodies lying in heaps against the perimeter fences. The body of Hajime Toyoshima was later found in a storm drain, his throat slit. Sergeant Kojima had also been killed in the attack, meaning that of the camp leadership, only Sergeant Major Kanazawa survived. Killing continued sporadically until 9 a.m, with prisoners popping up from the piles of bodies, yelling, "Go on, kill me," to which the guards gladly obliged. Later that morning, patrols from the infantry training center were sent out to round up the prisoners who had escaped into the countryside. While most of those still at large opted to surrender, some were determined to die an honorable death or cause as much mayhem as possible before being recaptured. 2 prisoners were killed by a farmer and his son hunting rabbits, while 2 laid their heads on a railway line and were beheaded. Another stole a rifle from a soldier, but when it turned out to be unloaded, he stabbed himself. In the end, 25 Japanese prisoners died outside the camp, bringing total casualties to 231 dead, 108 wounded. Meanwhile, 5 Australians had been killed and 4 wounded. In addition to Privates Hardy, Jones and Shepard killed on the night of the breakout, Lieutenant Harry Doncaster, a patrolling infantryman, was ambushed and stabbed to death by a band of escapees, while another Private Thomas Hancock was accidentally shot by a fellow soldier and later died of sepsis. While the Australian government wished to cover up the breakout for fear of reprisals against Australian and Allied POWs, in September 1944, Prime Minister John Curtin was forced to announce the bare facts of the incident. Curiously, the Japanese government chose to ignore the news, for announcing the breakout would have meant admitting that there were Japanese servicemen in captivity, something that was supposed to be impossible. As the last survivor of the camp leadership, Sergeant Major Kanazawa was tried in January 1945 for murder and inciting the breakout. He was convicted of the ancillary charge of conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline and sentenced to 15 months hard labor. However, he served his time in solitary confinement at Cowra before being repatriated to Japan in March 1946. For many of the Cowra prisoners, the imagined shame and rejection which had led them to rise up never materialized. As Masaru Mariki later recalled, "I came home on April the 8th, 1946, the only one from my village to return. The others had all died, and there was some discomfort, some suspicion towards me. My family believed I had been killed on the 11th of November 1942, and I had a plaque in my ancestor's tomb. But when I told them I had been a prisoner, someone said, 'Don't worry, you fought like a soldier. You should not worry about being in a prison camp. All Japan is a prison camp now.'" Today, little remains of the Cowra POW camp, except for a Japanese war cemetery built on land gifted to Japan by the Australian government in 1963. As a further sign of friendship between the former enemy nations, in 1978, a formal Japanese garden designed by landscape architect Ken Nakajima was built nearby. It remains the largest Japanese garden in the Southern Hemisphere.
The British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, is an institution known and respected the world over for its relative impartiality and objectivity compared to many other news sources, with numerous surveys showing that the BBC is one of the most trusted sources of news in both the UK and the US. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about dinner jackets, received pronunciation, the Nazis, and what all of this has to do with BBC News. Back when the BBC was first launched in 1922, the first general manager of the corporation, Scottish engineer Sir John Reith, was insistent that the BBC be as formal and quintessentially British as possible, and he created a number of rules towards this end. Fun fact, Reith had no experience with anything related to broadcasting when he applied to manage the BBC. One thing in particular Reith stressed when he first helmed the BBC is that the newscasters spoke the King's English, known today as BBC English, or more technically received pronunciation, as he felt it was a style or quality of English that would not be laughed at in any part of the country. Reith was also aware that the broadcasts might be played abroad and felt that a regional accent would be difficult for non-Britons to understand. Reith also noted, "We have made a special effort to secure in our stations men who, in the presentation of program items, the reading of news bulletins and so on, can be relied upon to employ the correct pronunciation of the English tongue. I have frequently heard that disputes as to the right pronunciation of words have been settled by reference to the manner in which they have been spoken on the wireless." No one would deny the great advantage of a standard pronunciation of the language, not only in theory, but in practice. Our responsibilities in this matter are obvious, since in talking to so vast a multitude, mistakes are likely to be promulgated to a much greater extent than was ever possible before. Further, in the 1929 BBC Handbook, it was noted that their pronunciation guidelines in this matter are not to be regarded as implying that all other pronunciations are wrong. The recommendations are made in order to ensure uniformity of practice and to protect the announcers from the criticism to which the very peculiar nature of their work renders them liable. As for received pronunciation, or RP as it's often abbreviated to, it is defined as the standard form of British English pronunciation. Though, funny enough, RP is only used by an estimated 2 to 3% of English people today, with the number of Scottish, Irish, and Welsh users being described as negligible. First defined in 1869 by linguist A.J. Ellis, received pronunciation basically entails pronouncing your words properly as they are written in the dictionary. Although the general idea behind received pronunciation is to attempt to remove a person's regional accent, it is nonetheless commonly associated with the south of England and the upper class. Meaning that, although received pronunciation masks a person's regional background, it says a lot about a person's social upbringing and how they were educated. With this in mind, although one of Wraith's goals in using RP was to appeal to the widest audience possible, many listeners still felt alienated by the broadcasts being beamed into their homes because of this upper-class accent being used. Despite this, newscasters were required to use received pronunciation right up until World War II. Why did this change during the war? The Ministry of Information was worried about the Nazis hijacking the radio waves. You see, during World War II, Nazi Germany invested a lot of time and money in training its spies and propagandists to speak using perfect received pronunciation so that they could effectively pass as Brits. Thus, the Ministry of Information became quite concerned that the Nazis could potentially issue orders over the radio in a voice that would be indistinguishable from one of their own newscasters. In addition, the then Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, noted the aforementioned fact that the total monopoly newscasters with upper-class sounding voices had on the news was offensive to the working class. This image of newsreaders being stuffy, upper-class toffs wasn't helped by an edict passed down in 1926 from Reef that stated any newscaster reading the news after 8 p.m. had to wear a dinner jacket while on air, despite that no one could see them. Former BBC radio personality Stuart Hibberd noted of this, "Personally, I have always thought it only right and proper that announcers should wear evening dress on duty. There are, of course, certain disadvantages. It is not ideal kit in which to read the news. I myself hate having anything tight around my neck when broadcasting, and I remember that more than once the engineers said my shirt front creaked during the reading of the bulletin." In any event, as a result of the concerns of Attlee and the Ministry of Information, the BBC hired several newscasters possessing broad regional accents that would be more difficult for Nazis to perfectly copy and would hopefully appeal to the common man. The first person to read the news on the BBC possessing a regional accent was one Wilfred Pickles, who spoke with a broad Yorkshire accent. Far from being a popular move, when Pickles was hired by the BBC in 1941, his accent offended so many listeners so much that they wrote letters to the BBC blasting them for having the audacity to sully the news with the Yorkshireman's voice. In fact, by 1949, Pickles himself noted that because of his accent, he had become the central feature in a heated national controversy, during which Pickles was frequently made fun of by various London cartoonists and in other forms of popular media. Nonetheless, after the end of World War II, the BBC continued to loosen its guidelines and, with the advent of more localized news, began to hire more people who spoke with the respective accent of the region they were being broadcast in. That said, the BBC does continue to generally use newscasters with more mild accents in international broadcasts to make sure they are as understandable as possible to those audiences.
In the winter of 1944 to 1945, the people of the Netherlands teetered on the brink of starvation. As the Allied advance through the south stalled in the wake of the ill-conceived Operation Market Garden, the Dutch government in exile ordered a nationwide railway strike in an attempt to cripple the occupying German army. In retaliation, the Nazis cut off food shipments to the major cities in the west. In Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, supplies of food and fuel rapidly dwindled, forcing citizens to survive on as little as 580 calories a day. In desperation, desperation, many turned to eating sugar beets and tulip bulbs, the latter of which had almost zero nutritional value and were potentially poisonous. Making matters worse, the winter of 44 to 45 was one of the coldest on record, causing canals to freeze over and making transport of supplies almost impossible. By the time the Allied air forces began making food drops in the spring of 1945, the so-called Hunger Winter had claimed the lives of 18,000 Dutch citizens. Curiously, however, one group of children in a Hague hospital appeared unaffected by the famine. In fact, they seemed to thrive in spite of it. The strange case would lead one doctor to solve a mystery which had baffled medical science for nearly 2,000 years. In the year 100 CE, the Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia first described a rare illness which mostly seemed to affect children. Its victims suffered from weakness, abdominal pain, copious foul-smelling diarrhea, and chronic wasting, often dying of starvation and malnutrition, regardless of how much food they consumed. Aretaeus named the baffling condition celiac disease, after the Greek word celiakos, meaning abdomen. Over the following 2 millennia, the disease would come to be known by many names, including chronic intestinal indigestion, intestinal infantilism, G. Herter's disease, celiac diathesis, celiac sprue, or simply sprue. But the cause and treatment remained as mysterious as ever. Researchers in the late 19th century ruled out a bacteriological cause for the syndrome affected children from all socioeconomic backgrounds and living conditions. Indeed, it seemed to affect wealthier children more, though some doctors theorized that poorer children simply died before a diagnosis could be made. Whatever the case, it was eventually concluded that any potential viable treatment for celiac disease would involve a combination of rest and diet. The first doctor to give a modern description of celiac disease was British paediatrician Samuel Gee of London's Hospital for Sick Children in 1887. Gee theorized that the disease was caused by an overabundance of dairy and starch and recommended that sufferers adopt a diet of raw meat, mussels, and toast while avoiding milk, rice, fruit, and vegetables. In 1908, American physician Christian Archibald Herter determined that fats were more readily tolerated by celiac patients than carbohydrates and recommended a similarly starch-free diet. As we shall soon see, both men were significantly off the mark, and these special diets did little to ease their patients' suffering. The first major breakthrough in the treatment of celiac disease was made in 1924 by American physician Sidney Haas, who prescribed a diet consisting largely of bananas. The diet was based on Haas's experiments in Puerto Rico, where he observed that the villagers who ate large amounts of bread often suffered from celiac, while the farmers who survived mostly on bananas seldom did. But unlike Gee and Herter's previous recommendations, Haas's banana diet actually seemed to work. In his influential 1924 paper on the subject, Haas described the cases of 10 children with celiac. Of these, the 8 treated with the banana diet made full recoveries, while the 2 left untreated eventually died. Children from around the country soon began flooding into Haas's clinic, while their desperate parents intercepted transport ships at the docks in order to get their hands on the precious life-saving bananas. Meanwhile, the banana industry decided to get in on the action and began heavily promoting Haas and his new miracle cure. Haas would eventually treat over 600 celiac patients over the course of his career, saving the lives of many. Unfortunately, he also made the mistake of claiming his banana diet constituted a permanent cure. Thus, when his patients eventually returned to their regular diets, they inevitably suffered from an immediate relapse. Indeed, while Haas had come tantalizingly close to unlocking the secret of celiac disease, his attention was focused on the supposed curative properties of the bananas. Consequently, he missed the key factor in the pathology of the disease, not what was added to his patients' diets, but rather what was missing from it. It would therefore take another decade and the efforts of another pioneering doctor before this 2 millennia-old medical mystery at last began to unravel. Willem Karel Dicker was born in 1905 in the Dutch city of Dordrecht. He studied medicine at the University of Leiden from 1922 to 1929 and specialized in pediatrics at the Juliana Children's Hospital in The Hague, becoming medical director in 1936 at the age of only 31. In 1932, Dicker attended a lecture at the Dutch Society for Pediatrics, where a fellow doctor presented a special medicinal powder meant to combat celiac disease. Dicker noticed, however, that the powder was often administered to patients alongside a regular breakfast of bread and marmalade, and that the consumption of bread nearly always corresponded with a relapse of symptoms. Speculating that bread, or rather wheat, might lie at the heart of the celiac mystery, in 1936, Dicker began a long-term study on a young boy suffering from the disease. Over several months, Dicker kept the boy on an entirely wheat-free diet and, to his delight, observed an immediate and dramatic improvement in symptoms. Furthermore, when the boy returned home to his parents and resumed his regular diet, he suffered an immediate and dramatic relapse. Based on these and other cases, in 1941, Dicker recommended that celiac patients avoid bread and wheat products entirely and stick to meat, fresh fruit, and vegetables. But as these were in short supply during the war, Dicker instead kept his patients on a simple diet of porridge made without wheat flour. But it was the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 that truly cemented Dicker's theory regarding the role of wheat in celiac. Within months of the Nazis imposing their blockade, wheat flour became nearly impossible to find and bread dropped completely off the Dutch menu. Yet while most of the children in Juliana Hospital were miserable for lack of bread, those with celiac seemed to thrive, with Dicker remarking that to the celiac children, the shortage of food was less severe than the toxic effects of wheat products. Indeed, over the course of the famine, the mortality rate of children with celiac dropped from nearly 35% to almost zero, and when the famine ended and bread was reintroduced to children's diets, mortality soared back to its pre-war levels. Dicker seemed to have finally discovered the true cause of celiac, but he had little time to investigate these findings. An ardent patriot, Dicker actively fought with the Dutch resistance, hiding downed Allied airmen in the basement of the Juliana Hospital. For this, he was arrested by the Gestapo and thrown in jail, only being spared execution due to a shortage of doctors in the Netherlands. After the war, however, Dicker embarked on a 5-year research program to prove his theories about the origins of celiac disease. He worked closely with biochemist J.H. van der Kamer of the Netherlands Central Institute for Nutritional Research in Utrecht, who had developed a method for measuring the fat content of a patient's stools. This, in turn, allowed Dicker and van der Kamp to determine the amount of food absorbed by a patient's intestines when fed various types of cereals. This research revealed that while regular wheat flour produced celiac symptoms, purified wheat starch did not, disproving the long-held theory that celiac was caused by starches. Further research finally succeeded in nailing down the real culprit, gluten, a product found in wheat and rye, but not in rice or most fruits and vegetables, including bananas. Research in Britain, Scandinavia, and Germany soon confirmed Dicker's findings, and a gluten-free diet became the standard treatment for celiac in much of the world. Strangely, however, this treatment was slow to be adopted in the United States due to the influence of Sidney Haas and the powerful banana lobby. As a result, celiac remains significantly underdiagnosed in the United States compared to the rest of the world. Today, we understand celiac disease to be an inherited autoimmune disorder affecting around 1 in 100 people worldwide. Gluten in the diet causes the immune system to attack the small intestine, destroying the fine hair-like projections called villi that line the intestinal wall. This, in turn, reduces the body's ability to absorb nutrients, resulting in the characteristic cramping, fatty diarrhea, malnutrition, and a host of other symptoms, including vitamin deficiency, osteoporosis, dermatitis, developmental delay, and increased incidence of certain cancers. But by following a strict gluten-free diet, the vast majority of celiac sufferers are able to live entirely normal lives. For his pioneering work on celiac disease, Wilhelm Karel Dicker was awarded the very first Dicker Medal, an award specially created in his honor by the Netherlands Society of Gastroenterology. He was also considered for the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1962, but his death soon afterward at the age of 57 eliminated him from contention. However, according to his colleagues, Dicker was a humble man and would not have wanted the award anyway. He would have been content knowing that his work had helped make life of sufferers of celiac disease, well, just a little bit less of a pain in the arse. War, they say, makes strange bedfellows. Never was this more true than during the Second World War, when many former bitter enemies formed uneasy alliances in the service of ultimate victory. For instance, the Soviet Union entered the war aligned with Nazi Germany, the two ideological enemies carving up Poland between them in September 1939. 2 years later, Hitler turned on Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union, whereupon the Soviets, despite their previous actions, became Britain and America's greatest ally. But this conflict also brought together internal enemies, uniting opposition factions with common patriotic purpose. Such was the case in the United States, where, in perhaps the ultimate case of strange bedfellows, the government teamed up with the Mafia to help win the war. In the 1930s and 1940s, there were two dominant mafia groups in the United States. Those run by the Italians, mainly Sicilians, and those run by Jews. While the Sicilian mafia can trace its origins to informal and ancient resistance movements against Sicily's various conquerors, the modern American organization was the product of fascist dictator Benito Mussolini's rise to power in the 1920s. As a northerner, Mussolini was highly unpopular in Sicily, and the various mafia clans put up a determined resistance to his rule on the island. Mussolini, in turn, saw the mafia as a challenge to his power, and tasked his right-hand man, Cesare Mori, with arresting, imprisoning, and humiliating mafia dons and other key members. These purges resulted in a mass exodus of mafioso to the United States, where they quickly established themselves as a persistent thorn in the side of American law enforcement. The Mafia infiltrated itself into a wide variety of enterprises, from bootlegging during Prohibition to more legitimate pursuits like the seafood market and politics. New laws had to be invented to counter the Mafia's growth, but even these barely put a dent in their operations. Indeed, by the 1960s, the American Mafia's annual revenues were estimated at $7 billion. Yet despite their antagonistic relationship with their adopted country, most American mafioso maintains their hatred for Mussolini and his fascist government. This was in stark contrast to many non-Mafia-affiliated Italian-Americans who continued to see Mussolini as a folk hero. The Fascist League of North America was founded by Italian immigrants in 1925 and quickly became a mouthpiece for Mussolini's regime in America, engaging in street brawls and other acts of violence against labor unions and anti-fascist groups. On one occasion, the League attempted to assassinate anti-fascist activist Carlo Trasca, but the Mafia intervened and forced the would-be assassin to kiss the organizer's hand. After years of violence, Mussolini decided to withdraw official support from the League in 1929, but Italian-American support for his regime persisted for more than a decade. The Mafia, however, remained staunchly anti-Mussolini, a fact which was to make them very useful once the United States entered the Second World War. In many American cities, Italian immigrants lived side by side with large Jewish communities, composed mainly of immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. This community also spawned a variety of organized criminal groups, which inevitably clashed with the Italian Mafia over territory. Over time, however, the two groups drew closer together and began collaborating on various criminal activities. One relationship that epitomized this growing bond was between Italian mafioso Charles Lucky Luciano and Jewish gangster Meyer Lansky in New York City. In the late 1920s, as the Mafia began to coalesce in New York, Luciano found himself working closely with a Sicilian mafioso who had escaped Mussolini's purges. Having many Jewish friends and colleagues, including Lansky, Luciano quickly grew tired of the older mafioso's rabid anti-Semitism and old-world values. In 1930, Luciano decided to purge the Mafia of its old guard during an ongoing power struggle known as the Castelmarese War. This war resulted in the creation of the Italian Mafia, as we tend to think of it today, consisting of 5 New York families: Luciano, Mangano, Profasi, Bonanno, and Gagliano, and several regional families scattered across the United States. While Jews, Irish, and other ethnicities were still denied official membership in the Italian Mafia, the organization still maintained close business partnerships with these groups. One of the main causes uniting the Italian and Jewish mafias was their shared hatred of fascism. 1936 saw the formation of the German-American Bund, a domestic political organization allied with Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. As support for Nazism grew and anti-Semitic riots began breaking out in the streets, New York State Judge Nathan Perlman recruited Meyer Lansky and the Jewish Mafia to disrupt the Bund's activities throughout the late 1930s. Lansky's violent activities against the Bund put him in the spotlight as a top Jewish gangster and helped make possible his later collaboration with the US government. On December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, officially entering the Second World War. Early the following year, the German Kriegsmarine launched Operation Drumbeat, a concerted U-boat assault on shipping just off the American coast. On February 9th, the French ocean liner SS Normandy caught fire and capsized in New York Harbor while being converted to a troop ship, while a few months later the FBI apprehended a ring of German spies and saboteurs who had been landed by U-boats on Long Island. US naval intelligence suspected that saboteurs had set fire to the Normandy and were helping to refuel the U-boats operating offshore using small boats. It was quickly becoming clear that criminals or not, the people running America's East Coast ports could not be ignored. In the spring of 1942, naval intelligence launched Operation Underworld under the direction of Captain Roscoe C. McCall and Lieutenant Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden. The operation set out to infiltrate the dock workers, but this proved difficult without Union connections. McCall and Haffenden thus arranged a meeting with Joseph Sox Lanza, a capo in the Luciano crime family and head of the Seafood Workers Union in Fulton Fish Market. While Lanza was willing to help the authorities, his authority was limited to the fish market. If the government wanted to infiltrate other unions, he said, they would need to talk to Lucky Luciano himself. But there was one small problem. At that time, Luciano was serving a 30-year sentence at Dunamora Prison in upstate New York, having been convicted for compulsory prostitution in 1936. All attempts at appeal had failed, making it likely that he would remain in prison for life. Though Luciano continued to run his empire from prison with the help of intermediaries like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, he longed to leave Dannemora, likening its isolation and cold climate to Siberia. The coming of the war and the problem of sabotage in American harbors seemed to bring the opportunity for escape that had been waiting for. Following a meeting with Meyer Lansky and naval intelligence, Luciano agreed to help the government by convincing various elements of the Italian-American community to side against the Axis powers. Naval intelligence officers were allowed to infiltrate dock workers' unions and hotels, bars, and clubs that were frequented by suspected spies, while the Mafia kept an eye out for saboteurs and broke up strikes that might interfere with the war effort. Navy agents even performed occasional collection tasks for the Mafia to keep up appearances. During all this, the government agreed to transfer Lucky Luciano to a prison in a warmer climate close enough to New York City to help facilitate the Mafia's cooperation with naval intelligence. While the Navy made it clear to Luciano that this was not a quid pro quo deal and that his prison sentence would not be commuted, Luciano, driven by his hatred of fascism, gave his full cooperation and helped keep the dock workers in line for the remainder of the war. That, anyway, is the official version of events. However, in Luciano's and Meyer Lansky's memoirs, both men claimed that Luciano was actually playing naval intelligence from the start. According to these accounts, Luciano had offered his services to the Navy much earlier in the war, but his advances were ignored. Wanting to stage an act of sabotage in order to attract the Navy's attention, Luciano turned to enforcer Albert Anastasia, who suggested burning the Normandy. Official records suggest that the Normandy fire was the main event which drove naval intelligence to approach the Mafia, indicating that they played directly into Luciano's hands. However, Luciano's memoirs are known to be riddled with exaggerations and misinformation, and it is far more likely that the fire was accidentally started by a worker with a welding torch, as corroborated by multiple eyewitnesses. Whatever the case, the Mafia's wartime activities extended far beyond America's shores. In 1943, the Allies began preparations for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Believing he could be of great service to the invasion effort, Lucky Luciano volunteered to land on Sicily and make contact with local Mafia families. While this request was denied, Luciano nonetheless succeeded in using his connections in America to establish communication with the Sicilian Mafia, allowing Allied agents to be infiltrated onto the island ahead of the invasion. He also convinced hundreds of Italian immigrants to provide naval intelligence with photos, sketches, and maps of the Sicilian coastline, allowing the landings to be more carefully coordinated. Operation Husky, which commenced on July 9, 1943, was an unqualified success, resulting in the capture of the island within a month and the collapse of Mussolini's fascist government. In an ironic twist of fate, Il Duce's decision to persecute the Sicilian Mafia resulted in his ultimate downfall. While US naval intelligence credited the swift success of the invasion to Luciano's Sicilian connections, such claims are highly exaggerated. Luciano was largely out of touch with the Sicilian Mafia, and the invasion proceeded so swiftly that any connections he did have would have likely had little impact on the final victory. While Luciano did play a key role in the invasion, his contributions were largely limited to providing intelligence on the Sicilian coastline. Despite this, and the Navy's insistence that he would not benefit from his collaboration, after the war, Luciano cited his wartime activities in an attempt to appeal his prison sentence. Naval intelligence repeatedly denied Luciano's claims until the Manhattan District Attorney's Office investigated and found them to be true. In 1946, Luciano was deported to Sicily under threat of imprisonment if he returned to America. The US government's collaboration with the Sicilian Mafia continued in the post-invasion years through the formation of the Italian Republic in 1946. While the Sicilian Mafia held different positions on Sicily's independence from Italy at first, the Mafia eventually played a role in quelling separatist and communist agitation. Meanwhile, Lucky Luciano enjoyed the boost to his reputation, but not his new life in Sicily, desperately yearning to return to America. In 1946, Meyer Lansky brought him to Cuba, where he opened a casino and resort and managed his old empire from closer to home, activities which inspired the plot of The Godfather Part 2. After barely a year in Cuba, however, Luciano was arrested and deported back to Italy, where he spent the remainder of his life, dying of a heart attack in Naples in 1962. It should also be noted that one of Luciano's Mafia rivals had a very different relationship to Mussolini than was the norm for the Mafia. Vito Genovese and Luciano were initially on opposite sides of the Castellammarese War, but sided with each other to end the conflict. After Luciano's arrest in 1936, Vito Genovese saw himself as his true successor and was willing to fight for his place in the Mafia. Plans changed in 1937 when Genovese fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge. In Italy, he supported Mussolini, even contributing $250,000 to build a new headquarters for the fascist party. Genovese was known to operate in the black market and even supply party figures with drugs. In 1943, he helped the fascists by using his connections in New York to put a hit on the previously mentioned anti-fascist activist Carlo Tresca. Genovese's loyalties to Mussolini and his use of Mafia resources in Tresca's assassination angered Luciano, who tried to leverage his knowledge of Genovese's involvement in his negotiations with the US government. For his service to the fascist regime, Genovese was honored with the Commendatore del Re, a civilian honor. Genovese changed loyalties when the Allies invaded Italy. He served as an interpreter for the Allies while running black market operations using the occupation's resources. In 1994, Genovese was arrested for his black market activities. He was extradited back to the United States to face trial for his original murder charge back in 1937. The charges against Genovese were dropped in 1945 when the poisoning of a material witness against Genovese collapsed the case. Unlike Luciano, Genovese found himself free and able to continue where he left off in the criminal underworld. Truly, all is fair in love and war. The United States' wartime collaboration with the Mafia is emblematic of the desperate and often morally fraught lengths the Allies went to in order to secure final victory over the Axis powers. Luciano and Genovese had different reasons to cooperate with the Allies, and each yielded very different results. When the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from the French town of Dunkirk in May 1940, it was forced to leave most of its weapons and equipment behind on the beaches. Thus, while the Royal Navy kept British home waters safe and the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command carried out nightly bombing raids against occupied Europe, the British Army found itself with few means of striking back against Nazi Germany. The solution came in 1940 with the creation of the Commandos, a group of elite, highly trained soldiers and Marines tasked with carrying out small-scale raids into occupied territory to collect intelligence, perform sabotage, and generally harass the enemy. The Commandos proved extraordinarily effective, carrying out some of the most daring special operations of the war. And perhaps the most daring commando raid of all time was a 1942 operation in which a group of 10 Royal Marines struck a crippling blow to German shipping using the unlikeliest of weapons, the humble canoe. This is the extraordinary tale of Operation Frankton and the Cockleshell Heroes. The German invasion of France in the summer of 1940 dramatically changed the strategic landscape of the war. Previously, German shipping could only access the Atlantic via the Baltic Sea and the Skagerrak Strait between Denmark and Norway, allowing it to be easily bottled in by the Royal Navy. Access to ports on the French coast not only gave German U-boats direct access to Britain's vulnerable western approaches, but also allowed Germany to carry out trade in raw materials with its ally Imperial Japan. Despite persistent efforts by the Royal Navy to cut off German shipping, blockade-running ships regularly succeeded in penetrating the British cordon, and in the 12 months from June 1941 to 1942, the Germans managed to bring in more than 25,000 tons of rubber, oil, and other raw materials from the Far East. Much of this trade was centered on the French port of Bordeaux, which soon became a prime target for Allied military planners. But there was a problem. Bordeaux, located some 100 kilometers inland from the mouth of the Gironde River, was a fiendishly difficult target. A conventional naval attack was out of the question, for any fleet would be spotted and destroyed by German ships, aircraft, and shore batteries long before it reached its target. Attack from the air was also ruled out, as a daylight raid would be swiftly shot out of the sky, while a night raid would be too inaccurate and risk inflicting excessive civilian casualties. One man, however, thought he had a solution. Major Herbert Blondie Hassler was a Royal Marines officer with a deep passion for sailing and small watercraft. Born in Dublin in 1941, as a boy, Hassler built his own canoe from instructions from Boy's Own magazine and took it on excursions around Portsmouth Harbour and the Isle of Wight. Knowing firsthand the manoeuvrability and stealth such craft could achieve, in early 1941 Hassler submitted a report to the British Admiralty outlining his plan for using small teams of men equipped with folding kayaks, known to the British as canoes or foilboats, to attack heavily defended enemy harbours. While similar ideas had been put forward by Commander Captain Roger Courtney, founder of the Special Boat Section, today the Special Boat Service, or SBS, the Admiralty found the concept too outlandish and rejected Hassler's suggestions. Then on December 19th, 1941, Italian naval frogmen of the elite Decima Flottiglia MAS unit carried out a spectacular raid on Alexandria Harbour in Egypt, seriously damaging the British battleships the HMS Queen Elizabeth and the HMS Valiant. The attackers used a unique weapon nicknamed Maiali, or Pig, a human torpedo ridden by two drivers with detachable warheads that could be fixed to the keel of a ship at anchor. This attack was preceded by a March 26 raid against Solda Bay in Crete using explosive motorboats called Barchetti, as well as a July 26th attack against Valletta Harbour using both of these weapons. These attacks demonstrated the effectiveness of small naval raiding forces, and in their wake, Winston Churchill called for Combined Operations, the headquarters of Commando Operations, to develop similar capabilities. Thus, in July 1942, Major Hassler was invited to establish a canoe raiding force based at Lumps Fort at Portsmouth Harbour, which for security reasons he dubbed the Royal Marines Boom Patrol Detachment, or RMBPD. The detachment, which ultimately numbered 34 men, was recruited mostly from the Royal Marines Small Arms School at Gosforth and the Royal Marine Auxiliary Battalion at Portsmouth Harbour Basin, and regularly conducted night patrols of the harbour's anti-submarine net booms, lending credence to the unit's codename. Finding the Royal Marines' existing four-boats too flimsy for his purposes, Hassler designed a larger, stronger version measuring 3 meters long, designated the Mark II Cockle. On September the 21st, 1942, Hassler submitted a plan for the RMBPD to attack German shipping in Bordeaux Harbour. The plan called for 3 cockle canoes carrying 2 men each to be transported via submarine to the French coast and released into the Gironde estuary. The raiders would then make their way up the river to Bordeaux, paddling at night and hiding during the day to avoid detection. The raiders' main weapon would be the limpet mine, a waterproof explosive charge fitted with magnets which could be attached to the bottom of a ship's hull using an extendable pole. Though they contained only 2 kilograms of explosives, when placed 2 meters or more below the waterline, the compression effect of the surrounding water allowed the limpets to blow a sizable hole in the hull of nearly any unarmored civilian ship. The mines were set off with a special acetone or AC fuse, which consisted of a spring-loaded firing pin held back by a plastic washer. To activate the fuse, the raider chose from a selection of glass ampules containing various concentrations of acetone and inserted it into the fuse body. He then turned a screw to break the ampule and released the acetone. After a delay, the acetone would eat away the washer, releasing the firing pin and setting off the mine. The delay being determined by the concentration of acetone selected and the temperature of the water. In addition to 8 limpet mines, each canoe would also be equipped with 3 sets of paddles, a compass and watch, a depth-sounding line, a repair kit, a camouflage net, rations, and water for 6 days, magnets on ropes to hold the canoe next to the target ship while placing the mines, and 2 hand grenades. Each man would also be equipped with a .45 caliber Colt 1911 pistol and a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. Once they had placed their mines, each canoe team would go ashore, hide or destroy their canoe, and make their way overland to the town of Rafec, where they would rendezvous with the French resistance and be smuggled across the border to neutral Spain. On October the 13th, 1942, Chief of Combined Operations Lord Lewis Mountbatten approved Hassler's plan, giving it the codename Operation Frankton. The force was doubled from Hassler's original 3 canoes to 6, each being named after a sea creature beginning with the letter C: catfish, crayfish, conger, cuttlefish, coalfish, and cachalot. This was an old name for a sperm whale, by the way. The force was divided into 2 groups, each with its own designated targets. A division with catfish, crayfish, and conger, and B division with cuttlefish, coalfish, and cachalot. Hassler himself commanded catfish along with crewmate Marine Bill Sparks, while a 13th man, Marine Norman Coley, was taken on as a reserve. After a month of training, including a full-scale simulated attack up the Swale River against the city of Deptford, the RMBPD was declared ready for action, and on November the 30th, 1942, the raiders and their canoes set sail from Holyloch, Scotland, aboard the Royal Navy submarine HMS Tuna. The men were not told their exact target until the submarine was well underway, as Norman Colley later recalled. "We knew it was supposed to be dangerous, but we were all about 20 years of age, so things like that didn't bother us. I thought the lads accepted it very well. Nobody expected to get back off it. It was a suicide mission." HMS Tuna was scheduled to reach the Gironde estuary on December the 6th, but her arrival was delayed by poor weather and to having to negotiate a minefield. Finally, at 7:30 p.m. on December the 7th, she surfaced and began launching the canoes. Cachalot, crewed by Marines W.A. Ellery and E. Fisher, was damaged while being manhandled up the submarine's narrow hatches, and neither man participated in the raid. Norman Colley, as the reserve, also remained on board, but the remaining 5 canoes were successfully launched and their crews paddled off into the night, now well and truly on their own. Trouble struck almost immediately as coalfish crewed by Sergeant Samuel Wallace and Marine Robert Ewart suddenly went missing, and strong winds and 1.5-meter waves caused conger, crewed by Corporal George Sheard and Marine David Moffat, to capsize. Unable to bail out of their craft, Sheard and Moffat instead scuttled it and held on to 2 of the remaining canoes, who dropped them off as close to the shore as they could. However, the flotilla soon spotted the missing coalfish, and the 4 canoes pressed on with the attack. The next major obstacle was a group of 4 German frigates guarding the entrance to the river. By lying flat on their canoes and paddling silently, the raiders managed to slip by unnoticed, but in the process, cuttlefish crewed by Lieutenant John McKinnon and Marine James Conway became separated from the group and was forced to come ashore nearby. Over the next 5 hours, despite a strong tidal current, the 3 remaining canoes managed to paddle 32 kilometers upriver before coming ashore near the town of St. Vivian de Medoc. There, they remained hidden throughout the following day. When the group set sail the following evening, however, coalfish was nowhere to be seen, its crew having been captured by the French gendarmerie or the national police the previous morning. Undeterred, catfish and crayfish pressed on, covering 35 kilometers on the night of the 8th and 9th of December, 24 kilometers on the 9th and 10th of December, and 14 kilometers on the 10th and 11th of December. Freezing winter temperatures and strong ebb tides made progress slow and exhausting, and at one point the raiders were discovered by a local family resting during the day. Finally, at 9 p.m. on the clear and calm night of December the 11th, the raiders slipped into Bordeaux Harbour, with catfish targeting the western side of the docks and crayfish the eastern side. Over the next 4 hours, the raiders succeeded in placing their 16 limpet mines on 6 vessels, including a large cargo ship, a small liner, and a German Speerbrecher patrol ship. All the while, they managed to avoid detection, though on one sphincter-tightening occasion, a sentry on the German patrol ship spotted something and shone his flashlight down at the water. Mercifully, his beam barely missed Hassler and Sparks directly below. The job done, at 12:45 a.m., crayfish and catfish slipped out of the harbour and headed downriver. They met each other by chance on the Ile Cazot. They carried on together for another 5 hours before sinking their canoes near Saint-Jean-de-Blay and setting off separately on foot for the Spanish border. 15 hours later, the 16 limpet mines detonated simultaneously, sending all 6 ships to the bottom. Operation Frankton was a success. This victory, however, had come at a heavy cost. Corporal Sheard and Marine Moffat of the Congo, which had capsized at the start of the mission, died of hypothermia, their bodies later being found farther up the coast. Lieutenant McKinnon and Marine Conway of the Cuttlefish managed to evade capture for 4 days before being betrayed and arrested by the gendarmerie in the town of La Réole, 50 kilometers south of Bordeaux, while Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills of the Crayfish lasted 2 days before being arrested at Montlieu-la-Gare. All 4 men, along with Sergeant Wallace and Marine Ewart of Coalfish, were interrogated by the Germans before being executed under Hitler's infamous Commando Order. This decree, promulgated in response to alleged violations of the Geneva Convention made by British commando raids on Dieppe and the island of Sark, ordered that all commandos and other special forces personnel be summarily executed as spies, regardless of whether or not they were in uniform. The only men to survive Operation Frankton were Major Hassler and Bill Sparks of Catfish, who successfully reached Rafik and made contact with the French resistance and made their way across the Pyrenees to Spain. It was not until February the 23rd, 1943, that Combined Operations Headquarters received a secret message from the resistance that Hassler and Sparks were safe. On April the 2nd, 116 days after setting off for the raid, Major Hassler arrived in Britain to a hero's welcome. For their actions, Hassler and Sparks were recommended for the Victoria Cross, the British Empire's highest award for gallantry. However, one requirement for receiving a Victoria Cross is that the recipient actually be fired upon by the enemy, and as the 2 men had managed to evade the enemy throughout the mission, they were disqualified. Instead, they were awarded the next highest honours, Hassler receiving the Distinguished Service Order and Sparks the Distinguished Service Medal. Laver and Mills of Crayfish were also recommended for the DSN, but at this time the medal was not awarded posthumously. Awards notwithstanding, Operation Frankton would go down in military history as one of the most daring special forces raids ever mounted, the men of the RMBPD forever immortalised as the cockleshell heroes. But daring aside, what had Operation Frankton actually accomplished? Unfortunately for the raiders, the harbour bottom at Bordeaux was relatively shallow, allowing the Germans to quickly repair and refloat the damaged ships. However, like most commando raids, the main impact of Operation Frankton was psychological, demonstrating to the beleaguered British people that their nation could still strike back against Nazi Germany. The raid also temporarily disrupted German international shipping and forced the Germans to tie up large amounts of men and resources guarding Bordeaux and other ports against future raids. According to Winston Churchill, this alone shortened the war by as much as 6 months. The success of Operation Frankton would inspire further similar strikes, including the September 26, 1943 Operation Jaywick raid against Japanese shipping in Singapore Harbor, which succeeded in sinking 6 ships. This was followed in October 1944 by the less successful Operation Rimau, which featured the use of James Bond-style motorized submersible canoes known as Sleeping Beauties. However, none of these operations captured the popular imagination like the Bordeaux raid, with Combined Operations Chief Lord Louis Mountbatten later stating, "Of the many brave and dashing raids carried out by the men of Combined Operations Command, none was more courageous or imaginative than Operation Frankton." The legacy of the Cockleshell heroes lives on in their spiritual successors, the Royal Navy's Special Boat Service, or SBS, whose official crest bears the highly appropriate motto, "By Strength and Guile." Floating in the azure blue waters of Lake Huapi, just offshore of the Argentine resort town of San Carlos de Bariloche, lies the tiny island of Huemul. Today, this tranquil little speck of land serves as a nature preserve visited only by the occasional kayak or tourist ferry. But the crumbling ruins dotting the islands, from roofless villas overgrown with vines to giant concrete cubes studded with rustling steel pipes, hint at a more mysterious past. These ruins are all that remain of a long-forgotten 1950s project straight out of a pulpy sci-fi comic book, wherein a former Nazi scientist built a secret island lab in an audacious attempt to unlock the secret of clean, limitless fusion power. This is the strange and controversial story of Ronald Richter and Project Huemul. The regime of Argentine dictator Juan Perón, who ruled the country from 1946 to 1955, is today infamous for its sympathetic relationship with Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Among the high-profile Nazi war criminals who saw refuge in Argentina after the war were Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, Eduard Roschmann, the butcher of Riga, and Dr. Joseph Mengele, Auschwitz's infamous Angel of Death. But not all these refugees were the purely political variety. Shortly after taking power, Perón conducted a ruthless political purge of the country's universities and research institutes, creating long-lasting enmity between the regime and the Argentine intelligentsia. Perón was thus forced to turn to Germany for the scientists and engineers he needed to kickstart his nation's economy and lead his mostly agrarian, impoverished people into the 20th century. Among those who accepted Perón's invitation were legendary aircraft designer Dr. Kurt Tank and collaborationist French engineer Émile Dewantin, who would go on to create Argentina's first domestically built fighter jet, the IAE-33 Pulki II. But perhaps the most promising import was Austrian physicist Ronald Richter, who promised to give Perón what he wanted: cheap, unlimited energy to power Argentina's industrial revolution. Ronald Richter was born in 1909 in the Austrian town of Falkenau an der Eiger, now Sokolov in the Czech Republic. According to most sources, Richter attended the German University of Prague, graduating with a doctorate in natural sciences in 1935. However, it is now known that this was not in fact the case. As a young doctoral candidate, Richter read an article about mysterious radiation, or delta rays, supposedly emitted by the Earth, and proposed to study these rays for his doctoral thesis. Despite the opposition of his thesis advisor, Professor Heinrich von Traubenberg, Richter pushed forward with his research and completed a thesis which claimed to confirm the existence of delta rays. However, the rays turned out to be merely cosmic gamma rays reflected by the Earth's surface, and Richter's thesis, full of speculation and spurious evidence, was never published. It was an incident which was to foreshadow much of Richter's later career. After leaving the university, Richter worked briefly in German industry, researching methods for accurately measuring and controlling the temperature of electric arc furnaces. In the course of this research, he discovered that injecting deuterium, a heavy isotope of hydrogen, into an electric arc produced a nuclear reaction and a shower of neutron particles that could be detected with a Geiger counter. It was an observation that would eventually lead Richter down the road to fusion research. During the Second World War, Richter worked with professors Max Steenbeck and Manfred von Ardenne on particle accelerators for the German atomic bomb program, which, unlike the Allied Manhattan Project, made little progress and was eventually abandoned. Post-war, Richter's career seemed to stall, with his only recorded jobs being a 6-month stint in explosives research and a handful of commercial contracts. But soon, a chance encounter would change Richter's life forever. In 1947, while in London, Richter ran into an aircraft engineer, Kurt Tank, who revealed he and a number of other German scientists were on their way to Argentina and invited Richter to join them. Traveling under the alias Dr. Pedro Macias, Richter arrived in Argentina in August 1948 and was taken to meet President Perón, who revealed that he had smuggled a German particle accelerator into Argentina and desperately needed Richter's expertise to operate it. But Richter had ideas of his own. Based on his previous research on electric arc furnaces, Richter had developed a scheme for generating fusion fusion power using a device he called a thermotron. The device would work by suspending deuterium, or the heavier isotope tritium, using powerful high-frequency sound waves and compressing it to a sufficiently high pressure and temperature to fuse the hydrogen atoms and release energy. The possibility of generating practical fusion power had been theoretically demonstrated in 1944 by Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, who calculated that due to quantum tunneling effects, certain hydrogen atoms would randomly be able to fuse at energies far lower than would normally be dictated by classical physics. These fusion events would in turn generate a large amount of energy, further heating and compressing the surrounding fuel and making the whole reaction self-sustaining. But while scientists had speculated widely on the feasibility of this process, Richter was the first to propose a practical, industrial-scale implementation of fusion power, generating considerable excitement within the Perón regime. Richter's scheme also aligned perfectly with Perón's national ambitions. While in 1946 the National Scientific Research Commission formed a committee to explore the peaceful uses of atomic energy to power Argentine industry, this endeavor was swiftly shut down by pressure from the United States, who wanted to retain their monopoly on the development of nuclear weapons. Richter's fusion scheme would have been the perfect compromise, allowing Argentina to develop cheap power for its mills and factories while avoiding the risk of nuclear proliferation. Furthermore, it would generate power using cheap, abundant hydrogen fuel, freeing Argentina from the need to import expensive uranium. Perón was immediately taken in by Richter's grand claims and effectively wrote him a blank check to carry out his scheme. Richter set up his first laboratory near Dr. Kurt Tank's aircraft research establishment in Cordoba, but in early 1949 a fire destroyed most of the facility. Richter believed the fire had been set by jealous scientists, opposed the Perón regime, and demanded a more secure location to carry out his experiments in secret. When the government did not immediately accede to his demands, Richter went on a tour of North America and Europe, pitching his ideas to various world governments. This thinly veiled threat to leave Argentina had the intended effect, and a suitable location was found on the Huemul Islands in Nahuel Huapi Lake, deep in Argentina's southern Rio Negro region. Perón also formed the National Atomic Energy Commission to administer the project, bypassing the Physical Association of Argentina, an association of purged scientists which had grown up in opposition to the regime. Construction of what became known as Proyecto Huemal began in July 1949, absorbing so much building material that it caused a nationwide shortage of concrete and bricks. This shortage was not helped by Richter's erratic and perfectionist behavior. When the giant 12-meter-high concrete cube which was to house the main reactor was finally completed in May 1950, Richter noticed that some of the embedded fuel pipes leading to the reactor core had been incorrectly installed, and he ordered the entire structure torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Meanwhile, Richter carried out a series of experiments in a much smaller experimental reactor, feeding hydrogen and lithium into an electric arc, bombarding it with sound waves and measuring the particles that were emitted. These tests created powerful shock waves that shook windows in nearby Bariloche and, on one occasion, cracked the 2-meter-thick walls of the experimental reactor building. This was an event which convinced Richter he was on the right path. In early 1941, construction on the Huemul laboratory was at last completed. The state-of-the-art facility, which employed some 400 scientists and technicians, had absorbed some 850 tons of cement, 50 tons of copper, and over $1 billion pesos. That's $422 million in today's money. Heavily guarded and shrouded in secrecy, it was a villain lair straight out of a James Bond movie, with the eccentric, messy-haired Richter playing the role of mad scientist to perfection. But this egregious expense all seemed worthwhile, for on February the 16th, 1951, Richter announced that he had achieved the world's first sustained thermonuclear fusion reaction. On March the 24th, shortly before an international summit of South American leaders, an ecstatic President Perón paraded Richter in front of the press, claiming that the future of energy would be sold in containers the size of milk bottles and might even become too cheap to meter. Perón's announcement stunned the world scientific community, with many wondering how a mostly rural, impoverished nation of 16 million could have achieved what even the US and the USSR had barely even begun to research. As you have probably guessed by now, the answer is it didn't. Doubts about Richter's theories and credentials began to emerge long before construction began on Huemul Island. During Richter's 1950 European tour, he met Austrian-Swedish physicist Lise Meitner, who in 1938 became the first scientist to demonstrate nuclear fission. After listening to an account of his early arc furnace experiments, Meitner dismissed Richter's claim that he he had achieved fusion, arguing that the phenomenon he observed was merely a chemical effect. On February the 23rd, shortly after the announcement of the first fusion reaction, a technician approached Richter and suggested that the measurements he had taken had in fact been erroneous, caused by a photographic plate being incorrectly set up in a spectrograph. However, Richter dismissed this claim and refused to rerun the experiment, instead ordering the reactor torn down and rebuilt in a new, more powerful configuration. As months passed and no further scientific evidence emerged from Huemul Island, more and more scientists began to express their doubts. One prominent skeptic was Professor Hans Thöring, the director of the Institute for Theoretical Physics in Vienna. In a May 1951 article in the journal United Nations World, titled "Is Perron's A-Bomb a Swindle?", Thöring viciously attacked Richter's claims, stating that it is a 50% probability that Perron is giving credit to the ravings of a fantasist, a 40% probability that the president has been the victim of a huge scam, and a 9% chance that Richter is telling the truth. Richter was quick to retaliate, reiterating in a response piece Argentina has no atomic bomb, that his fusion system was incapable of producing weapons-grade nuclear material, and denouncing Thöring as a typical textbook professor with a strong scientific inferiority complex, probably supported by political hatred. Richter did not, however, provide a clear explanation of how his reactor worked or any evidence to back up his claims, only offhandedly revealing that his thermotron was fueled by the isotope lithium-6. Frustrated by Richter's continued evasiveness, the Physical Association of Argentina, under the leadership of physicist Enrico Gaviola, pressured the Perron government to allow independent scientific review of Project Huemul. And so, on June the 21st, 1951, Richter invited the international press on a tour of the Huemul Island facilities. The reporters, however, were forbidden to enter most of the laboratory buildings and returned from the tour without any answers. Shortly thereafter, Perron invited Dutch physicist Cornelius J. Bakker to verify Richter's results, but his visit also proved inconclusive. Nonetheless, Perron continued to enthusiastically back Richter, even awarding him the Gold Peronista Party Medal in an elaborate ceremony. Meanwhile, American scientists continued to dismiss Richter's claims, with George Gamow, an early pioneer of the Big Bang Theory, stating it seemed to be 95% pure propaganda, 4 3/4% thermonuclear reactions on a very small scale, and the remaining 1/4% probably something better. Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, was even more blunt, writing, "Reading one line, one has to think he's a genius. Reading the next line, one realizes he's crazy." Not even Perron could save Richter from this rising tide of international condemnation, and in September 1952, the end finally came for Project Huemul. The Argentine scientific community finally managed to convince Perron to launch a full investigation into Richter's experiments, and an investigative team led by Jose Antonio Balsiero was dispatched to Huemul Island in September. It did not take long for them to expose the entire project as a fraud. While fusion reactors require temperatures of around 40 million Kelvin, the highest temperatures Richter had been able to achieve were some 400 times lower. The investigators also discovered that most of the scientific instruments weren't even connected. The team presented their findings in February 1953, and the government gave Richter time to issue an official response. Finding Richter's report inadequate on November the 22nd, Perron ordered a military unit to occupy Huemul Island. Richter was arrested and became a national laughingstock, with Argentine sarcastically referring to the project as Huele a Mula, or smells like a con. Richter remained under house arrest until 1955, when Perron was deposed in a coup. On October the 4th of that year, Richter was rearrested by the new government, convicted of fraud, and served a short prison sentence. Following his release, he traveled the world, offering his dubious services to various governments, spending many years in Libya before finally returning to Argentina. Ronald Richter died in Buenos Aires in 1991 at the age of 82. Though all but forgotten today, Project Huemul caused a major scandal in Argentina, and the question of whether Ronald Richter was an outright con man or simply an ambitious but misguided dreamer remains the subject of considerable debate. While Richter's evasiveness and the shoddy organization of the Huemul laboratories point to outright fraud, based on the testimony of those who knew the man, it appears that Richter sincerely believed in his theories and his work, but lacked the theoretical knowledge to turn his ambitions into reality. But despite this, the hundreds of millions of dollars poured into Project Huemul did not go to waste. Soon after the military takeover of Huemul Island, Jose Balsiero had much of Richter's equipment moved to nearby Bariloche, where it formed the basis of a new nuclear research facility, the Instituto Fisia de Bariloche. The institute, renamed in Balsiero's honor in 1962, continues to perform world-class physics research to this very day. Project Waymo also had another unexpected effect on the field of physics. In early 1951, American physicist Lyman Spitzer was on a ski trip in Aspen, Colorado, when he heard Richter's announcement of the first successful fusion reaction. While Spitzer immediately deduced that Richter's device would never work, he began to ponder the practical possibilities of fusion energy and spent much of his ski trip designing a new kind of fusion reactor, which he dubbed the Stellarator. Arguing that projects like Richter's would cause the United States to fall behind technologically, Spitzer convinced the US government to fund the construction of a prototype Stellarator, which he completed in 1953. Spitzer's work kicked off a flurry of fusion research not only in the US, but also in the UK, the USSR, and elsewhere, research that would eventually lead to the most advanced and promising fusion project in history, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, in Cadarache, France, which is expected to start producing fusion power sometime in the year 2025. However, the road to ITER has been a long and rocky one, plagued with numerous Kreml-like frauds and scandals. For example, in September 1957, the British government announced that its zero-energy thermonuclear assembly, or Zeta reactor, had achieved the first sustained thermonuclear reaction, with newspaper headlines breathlessly announcing that the nation had built its own miniature sun. But the government was soon forced to withdraw its announcement when, embarrassingly, the touted measurements turned out to be the result of faulty instruments. 3 decades later, electrochemists Martin Fishman and Stanley Pons announced that they had achieved so-called cold fusion at room temperature, triggering another media frenzy before these claims too were thoroughly debunked. It remains to be seen whether projects like ITER will prove to be the breakthrough that scientists have been seeking for decades, or just another frustrating dead end. For 3 decades following its closure in 1953, Kreml Island remained under the control of the military, who frequently used it for artillery and bombing practice. In 1995, the island was purchased by a tourism company which continues to offer daily boat tours from the port of Bariloche. For tourists visiting the islands, the crumbling, overgrown remains of Project Waymo serve as a poignant reminder of the dreams of a nation, the heady technological enthusiasm of the 1950s, and humanity's ongoing quest for a clean and limitless source of energy. 200 kilometers off the coast of Mozambique lies the island nation of Madagascar. With a land area of 587,000 square kilometers, it is the 4th largest island in the world after Greenland, New Guinea and Borneo, and the 2nd largest island nation after Indonesia. A French colony from 1896 to 1960, Madagascar has long been the world's primary producer of vanilla and cloves, though today the island is primarily known as a biodiversity and ecotourism hotspot, with 90% of its wildlife, including the famous ring-tailed lemur, being found nowhere else. But Madagascar once came close to having a much darker claim to fame: the world's largest concentration camp. In the early days of the Second World War, the Nazis briefly considered solving the so-called Jewish problem by deporting all of Europe's Jews to the African island and forcibly holding them there under brutal conditions. While this plan was short-lived, it was instrumental in the eventual adoption of the final solution, which resulted in the systematic murder of nearly 6 million Jews. This is the story of the forgotten prelude to the Holocaust. The idea of deporting or encouraging the emigration of European Jews to Africa, and Madagascar in particular, long predates the Third Reich and was actively promoted by pro- and anti-Jewish groups alike. Among the first to suggest such a plan was German Orientalist scholar Paul de Lagarde, who detailed his proposal in his 1878 work Deutschschriften, or German Writings. Indeed, de Lagarde's ideas regarding anti-Semitism, anti-slavism, social Darwinism, and territorial expansionism are considered instrumental to the development of Nazi ideology. In 1903, British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain proposed the creation of a Jewish homeland in Uganda, then a colony of British East Africa. Chamberlain's motives for promoting this plan were threefold. First, the rising number of pogroms or anti-Semitic riots in Eastern Europe, including the Kishinev pogrom of April 19th to the 21st, 1903, had resulted in a wave of Jewish immigration to the United Kingdom. Not only was Chamberlain genuinely concerned for the welfare of Eastern European Jews, but he sought to protect the jobs of native British workers from a sudden influx of Jewish immigrants. Second, the Uganda Railway, built between 1895 and 1901, had proven an exorbitantly expensive boondoggle and had failed to provide the desired return on investment. The immigration of Jews to the region, it was hoped, would boost the local economy and help offset the cost of the railway. Finally, following the conclusion of the Second Boer War in 1902, the British were keen to secure Jewish support for their colonial policies in South Africa. On August 26, 1903, Theodor Herzl, founder of the modern Zionist movement, presented Chamberlain's scheme at the 6th World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Hertz assured the gathered delegates that the scheme would not interfere with the ultimate Zionist goal of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine and would instead instead provide a temporary refuge for Jews facing persecution in Eastern Europe. By a vote of 295 to 178, the Congress decided to send an investigatory commission to Uganda to evaluate the proposed territory for settlement. The commission, composed of British explorer Major Alfred Gibbon, Swiss Orientalist Alfred Kaiser, and Zionist engineer Nachum Wilbush, arrived in Gauss Negishu in December 1904. While their final report was ambiguous regarding the suitability of Uganda for Jewish settlement, the plan faced strong opposition from both sides on ideological grounds. Many Zionists considered the plan a betrayal of the Zionist program and an unnecessary distraction from their ultimate goal of establishing a Palestinian homeland. Meanwhile, white settlers in British East Africa protested the mass immigration of Jews into the region. As a result, the British government soon withdrew the offer, while the scheme was officially rejected by the Zionist movement at the Seventh World Congress in 1905. Undeterred, Congress members Nahum Sirkin and Israel Zangwill formed a separate territorialist movement to explore the resettlement of Jews to Canada, Australia, Mesopotamia, or Cyrenaica, today Iraq and Libya. However, strong opposition from local residents also scuppered these projects. One resettlement plan which did see some success, however, was the Galveston scheme, which, aided by American banker Jacob Schiff, saw some 9,300 Jews immigrate to southern Texas between 1907 and 1914. As anti-Semitism grew increasingly prevalent throughout the 1920s and 30s, Paul de Lagarde's ideas on forcibly deporting Europe's Jews to Africa, particularly Madagascar, came back into fashion. In 1937, the Polish government, with the assistance of France, sent a task force to Madagascar to evaluate the feasibility of Jewish resettlements. The task force reported that due to the climate and poor infrastructure, the islands could only accommodate a maximum of 5,000 to 7,000 families, and the plan was thus abandoned. Just a year later, however, the Madagascar plan was resurrected in, where else, but Nazi Germany. Following the gradual disenfranchisement of German Jews via the Nuremberg laws and other anti-Semitic policies, the Nazis' initial final solution was simply to deport them elsewhere. However, few of Germany's neighbours were willing to accept their Jews. Indeed, in a meeting on December 9, 1938, French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet informed German Foreign Minister Joachim de Ribbentrop of the French government's own wish to deport some 10,000 of its own Jews, preferably to Madagascar. However, the idea of overseas deportation was shelved once again following the 1939 invasion and occupation of Poland, which furnished Germany with a large neighbouring territory into which it could expel its Jewish population. Under the Nisko Plan, created by the Foreign Policy Office chief Alfred Rosenberg and SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, Jews from Germany, Austria, and recently occupied Czechoslovakia and Poland would be transported to and concentrated within a 1,000 square kilometre area south of Lublin, Poland, known as the Lublin Reservation. Here, it was hoped the combination of overcrowding, poor land, and the conscription of Jews for forced labour would result in the eventual decimation and liquidation of the population. The first trainload of 2,700 Czech and Austrian Jews arrived in the Lublin Reservation on October 18, 1939. Though barracks were planned, none were completed, and the first deportees were left to fend for themselves in an open, swampy field with no water and little food. By April 1940, some 95,000 Jews had been transported to the area. Large numbers died of starvation, exposure, overwork, and diseases like typhus brought about by the cramped, unsanitary living conditions. However, the Nazis were soon forced to abandon the Nisko Plan, largely for pragmatic reasons. The trains used to transport deportees to the reservation were needed elsewhere for military purposes, while Hans Frank, head of the German government in German-occupied Poland, opposed the further influx of Jews into his district, claiming it had become too crowded. At the same time, the Nazi doctrine of Lebensraum, or living space, which had underpinned the invasion of Poland, was proving to be economically flawed, as the ethnic Germans resettled to areas cleared of native Poles and Jews found themselves with little to do. Finally, the deportation of Jews to Lublin was attracting international condemnation, prompting the Nazis to seek a less conspicuous method of solving the Jewish question. Following the Nazi invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, the idea of deporting Europe's Jews to Madagascar was resurrected once again. On June 3, 1940, Franz Rademacher, head of the Jewish department of the German Foreign Office, sent a memorandum to his superior, diplomat Martin Luther, proposing the deportation of all Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe to foreign territory. He initially considered Palestine as a destination, but quickly rejected this idea for fear of a strong Jewish state being established in the Middle East. Instead, he proposed Madagascar, the use of which could be added to the peace terms once France capitulated. The memorandum read in part, "The approaching victory gives Germany the possibility, and in my view also the duty, of solving the Jewish question in Europe." The desirable solution is all Jews out of Europe. In the peace treaty, France must make the island of Madagascar available for the solution of the Jewish question and to resettle and compensate the approximately 25,000 French citizens living there. The island will be transferred to Germany under a mandate. Diego Suarez Bay and the port of Anserrain, which are seas strategically important, will become German naval bases. In addition to these naval bases, suitable areas of the country will be excluded from the Jewish territory, Juden Territorium, for the construction of air bases. That part of the island, not required for military purposes, will be placed under the administration of a German police governor who will be under the administration of the Reichsführer SS. Apart from this, the Jews will have their own administration in this territory, their own mayors, police, postal and railroad administration, etc. The Jews will be jointly liable for the value of the island. For this purpose, their former European financial assets will be transferred for use to a European bank to be established for this purpose. Insofar as the assets are not sufficient to pay for the land which they will receive and for the purchase of necessary commodities in Europe for the development of the island, the Jews will be able to receive bank credits from the same bank. As Madagascar will only be a mandate, the Jews living there will not acquire German citizenship. On the other hand, the Jews deported to Madagascar will lose their citizenship of European countries from the date of deportation. Instead, they will become residents of the Mandate of Madagascar. Use can be made for propaganda purposes of this generosity shown by Germany in permitting cultural, economic, administrative, and legal self-administration to the Jews. It can be emphasized at the same time that our German sense of responsibility towards the world forbids us to make the gift of a sovereign state to a race which has no independent state for thousands of years. This would still require the test of history. Indeed, plans to this effect were already being made in other government departments. At the time, Hitler and the generals were preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which could potentially bring millions more Jews and other undesirables under German jurisdiction. As such a large mass of people could not be practically interred in Poland or anywhere else in mainland Europe, deportation overseas appeared a preferable solution. In a May 1940 memorandum concerning the treatment of the alien population in the East Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler declared, quote, "I hope to see the term Jew completely eliminated through the massive immigration of all Jews to Africa or some other colony." Luther discussed Rademacher's proposal with the foreign minister Ribbentrop, whereupon it came to the attention of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA. In January 1939, Heydrich had been appointed by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring to oversee the deportation of all Jews from German-occupied territory. He thus insisted that the implementation of Rademacher's plan fell under his jurisdiction. Thus, on August 15, 1940, Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann released a memorandum titled RSHA Madagascar Project, outlining the details of the scheme. Heydrich's plan called for the resettlement of 1 million Jews every year over a period of 4 years, with the entire island of Madagascar converted into a giant ghetto and police state administered by the SS. Hitler immediately approved the proposal. But while France surrendered unconditionally on June 22, 1940, the Madagascar plan could not immediately be implemented since the British Royal Navy controlled all the sea routes out of mainland Europe. Hitler hoped that after defeating the Royal Air Force and invading Britain in Operation Sea Lion, the British merchant fleet could be commandeered to transport Europe's Jews to Madagascar. But following the Luftwaffe's defeat in the Battle of Britain in September 1940, the Royal Navy remained in control of the seas, and the Nazis were forced to shelve the Madagascar plan once again. 2 years later, in May 1942, the Allies invaded Madagascar and placed the island under Free French control, denying its use to the Germans. By this time, however, the Nazi program to make Europe Judenfrei, or free of Jews, had taken a far darker turn. At a conference in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee on January 20th, 1942, a delegation of German officials, including Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, hammered out the details of the final solution to the Jewish problem: the systematic murder of all European Jews in purpose-built death camps. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest single campaign of the Second World War, lasting from the very first day of the war in Europe to the very last. The battle pit German U-boats against Allied merchant shipping in a struggle for control of the Atlantic sea lanes, essential to keeping the British Isles supplied with food, fuel, and other raw materials. So vital was this lifeline to Britain's survival that Winston Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." Throughout the conflict, both sides suffered dramatic reversals of fortune until late 1943, when the Allies finally wrested control of the Atlantic from the Germans. While this success is often attributed to the introduction of superior weaponry such as escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and radar, the real key to victory was doctrinal, with the Allies learning through trial and error how best to use tactics and technology to counter and neutralize the U-boat menace. And pivotal to this learning process was a unique unit of young women who for 3 years spent nearly nearly every day holed up in an attic in Liverpool, playing out elaborate combat scenarios with model ships on the floor. They were the Western Approach's Tactical Unit, or WWII, the wargamers who helped win a real war. Almost the moment war was declared on September 3, 1939, the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, launched a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied merchant shipping in the Atlantic. Its goal was to starve Britain into submission and bring its leaders to the negotiating table, and early on it seemed as though the Germans might just succeed. Between July and October 1940, U-boats sank nearly 1.5 million tons of Allied shipping, and by 1941 had reduced Britain's yearly imports from a pre-war total of 68 million tons to a mere 26 million tons. In 1942, Admiral Karl Donitz, head of the U-boat arm, calculated that if he could inflict sustained losses of 700,000 tons per month, Germany would win the war. What makes these losses even more staggering is the fact that unrestricted submarine warfare was nothing new, the Imperial German Navy having employed the exact same strategy some 20 years before. However, a number of factors resulted in the lessons of the Great War falling by the wayside. Among these was the British Admiralty's inherent disdain for submarines, which First Sea Lord Sir Arthur Wilson had infamously dismissed as underhanded, unfair, and damned un-English. Consequently, Royal Navy doctrine in the interwar years barely mentioned submarines at all, and the strategy of grouping merchant shipping into convoys, which had proven so effective against U-boats during the First World War, had largely been abandoned by the start of the Second. Adding to the Admiralty's woes was the loss of their naval bases in Ireland in April 1938 and the German occupation of France in May 1940, which simultaneously limited British access and increased German access to Britain's vital Western approaches. It was also hamstrung by its rigid command structure, wherein warship commanders were given very little individual initiative, leading to convoy escorts being led on frequent wild goose chases on orders from shore. But even after the Royal Navy managed to reorganize itself into a more effective anti-submarine force, it still faced the problem that although British naval doctrine had not moved on since 1918, German doctrine had. During the First World War, German U-boats had operated alone, with each commander seeking out and sinking targets on his own initiative. This approach, however, had been rendered ineffective by the introduction of the convoy. So between the wars, the German Navy developed the Rotte, or Wolfpack tactic. In the system, U-boats patrolled in extended lines across known convoy routes. When a U-boat located a convoy, it would radio in its position to headquarters, which would then order the whole pack to converge on the convoy and attack as a group, overwhelming the escorts. While the Allies were aware of this overall strategy, they didn't know exactly how U-boat wolfpacks approached and attacked convoys. And aside from a few enterprising individuals like Frederick Johnny Walker and Clarence Howard Johnson, few escort commanders possessed effective tactics for protecting their convoys and sinking U-boats when attacked. To help solve this problem, in January 1942, Admiral Cecil Arsborn formed the Western Approach's Tactical Unit, or WWII, a dedicated wargaming and analysis organization under the command of Commander Gilbert Roberts. A career officer who had joined the Navy as a cadet at the age of 13 from 1935 to 1937, Roberts studied at the Portsmouth Tactical School, where he became an avid practitioner of war games, especially those developed by Frederick T. Jane, founding editor of the famous Jane's Military Reference Guides. In 1937, Roberts was given command of the destroyer HMS Fearless, which was sent to patrol the Iberian coast during the Spanish War. In October 1938, however, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, declared medically unfit to serve at sea, and forced to retire from the Navy. Roberts' posting to the WWII proved fortuitous. Not only was he an avid wargamer and also a skilled communicator, but according to author Terence Robertson, it seemed that by design or accident, all the misfits of the Navy had congregated at Liverpool. Among his brother officers were many of his own kind, passed overs who at some stage or another had become red tape rebels. But the vast majority were officers of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, weekend sailors churned out by the recruiting machine, often with inadequate training. The Royal Navy Reserve, those independent merchantmen who would become sore boils in big ship wardrooms, somehow fitted in here, providing their expert seamanship to balance the ignorance of the willing but the lamentably green. However, Roberts' colleagues and staffers described him as a difficult man to work with, stubborn, demanding, and argumentative. But whatever his faults, his work with the WWII would prove decisive in securing Allied victory in the Atlantic. Housed on the top floor of the Western Approach's command headquarters in Derby House, Liverpool, the WWII was mainly staffed by members of the Women's Royal Navy Service, or WRENS, many of whom were as young as 17 at the time of the unit's founding. Some, like Laura Howes and Janet Arkle, were hired for their mathematical or tactical skills. Others, like Nancy Wales, for their proficiency in team sports, in Wales's case hockey. 66 WRENS in total would serve in the unit between 1942 and 1945. WWII's task was to play through both actual and hypothetical encounters between convoys and U-boat wolfpacks in order to work out the tactical tactics used by the Germans and develop potential countermeasures. This was done on a large playing surface laid out on the floor of the largest room in the building, which was divided into 10-inch squares, each representing a nautical mile. Merchant ships, escorts, and U-boats were represented by small wooden models, each of which was given precise attributes based on their real-life counterparts, such as maximum speed, minimum turning radius, and sonar, radio, and weapons range. Wrens playing as escorts stood behind cloth screens and could only view the board through small peepholes, while those playing as U-boats were given an unrestricted view. To further complicate matters, lines representing the courses of U-boats were traced in green chalk, nearly invisible against the brown floor, while the courses of merchantmen and escorts were traced in white. Each team was given 2 minutes to confer and issue their orders, which were conveyed using slips of paper to prevent the other team from overhearing. The Wrens quickly became ruthlessly efficient at their jobs, with 19-year-old Janet Ockle defeating Western Approaches commander and World War I submarine veteran Admiral Max Horton no less than 5 times in simulated combat. One of the first problems solved by the WWII was how U-boats were managing to sink merchantmen in the interior of convoys. At first, naval planners assumed that the U-boats were attacking from outside of the convoy as they had during the First World War, but given that escorts operated up to 5,000 yards out from the convoy and German torpedoes only had a range of 5,400 yards, this seemed unlikely. By replaying the past convoy battles, WWII determined that the U-boats were actually attacking the convoy from within, approaching from behind while surfaced and using their superior speed and the cover of darkness to slip past the escorts unnoticed. In response, the WWII developed a counter-strategy known as Raspberry, whereby, upon a ship being torpedoed, the escorts to the sides and rear of the convoy would fall astern into a line abreast and drive forward, blasting their sonar, while the forward escorts would zigzag ahead of the convoy. This would effectively trap the infiltrating U-boat, all but guaranteeing its destruction. The tactic's name came from Ren Jean Laidlaw, who likened the maneuver to blowing a raspberry at Hitler. Another tactic developed by WWII, codenamed Pineapple, was intended for use against U-boats lying in wait ahead of the convoy. Upon detection of the U-boat, the escorts were to steam ahead at full speed for 15 minutes, blasting their sonar and firing star shells before falling back into their regular positions. This would, in theory, scare off the U-boat and prevent it from observing and reporting other escort tactics like Raspberry. When this tactic was first demonstrated to a visiting Royal Canadian Navy officer, he pointed out that the diagram looked rather like a pineapple, and the name stuck. Another tactic, called beta search, used the opposite approach. Once the U-boat was detected, one escort ship was to advance towards it without using its sonar, firing star shells, or dropping depth charges. If, as predicted, the U-boat submerged, the escort would sail over it, tricking the U-boat captain into thinking that he hadn't been spotted. But a submerged U-boat was far slower than a surfaced one, making it vulnerable to the rest of the escorts, who, under the cover of the convoy, would advance and drop depth charges on the U-boat's predicted position. In late 1943, Roberts began receiving reports that U-boats had been targeting the escorts themselves. These attacks, however, were highly unusual. Though in every case the escort spotted the U-boat and turned towards it, they were somehow always torpedoed from behind. Roberts realized that the Germans had developed an acoustic torpedo which homed in on the sound of a ship's propellers. This torpedo, which the Germans called the T5 Zaun Koning, or the Allies called the German Navy Acoustic Torpedo, or NAT, was first developed in August 1943 and threatened to tip the balance of power in the Atlantic in favor of the U-boats. However, in an inspired bit of deduction, Roberts predicted that the torpedo's acoustics could only track targets inside a 60-degree cone directly ahead of it, and developed a tactic known as step aside to exploit this weakness. Upon spotting a surfaced U-boat, an escort was to fire a star shell, announcing to the U-boat that it had been spotted and forcing it to submerge and fire its torpedo. The escort would then make a hard 150-degree turn and accelerate to full speed, placing it outside the torpedo's acoustic cone before homing in and attacking the submerged U-boat. Along with decoy noisemakers called Foxer and Cat, which were towed behind escorts to deflect acoustic torpedoes, step aside effectively negated any advantage granted by the new technology. In addition to developing new anti-submarine tactics, the WWII also ran regular training courses to teach these tactics to naval officers. Starting in February 1942, these courses ran 6 days a week, every week until July 1945. In total, over 5,000 personnel participated in these courses, including officers from RAF Coastal Command and allied nations such as the United States, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, Poland, Norway, and Free France. WWII also compiled regular memos known as Atlantic Convoy Instructions, which were distributed to every escort ship operating in the Atlantic. In this manner, Western Approaches Command was able to keep pace pace with changes in German doctrine and stay one step ahead of the U-boats. The results were dramatic. From 120 ships sunk in October 1942, by December, losses had fallen to only 76 and continued to decline steadily thereafter. The success of WWII inspired the creation of sister organisations in London, Derry and Belfast, Northern Ireland, Irwell and Osprey in Scotland, Halifax in Canada, Freetown in Sierra Leone and Bombay in India. But perhaps the greatest testament to the unit's effectiveness was the fact that in U-boat headquarters in Flensburg, Germany, Admiral Donitz hung up a photograph of Commander Gilbert Roberts with the caption, "This is your enemy, Captain Roberts, Director of Anti-U-Boat Tactics." By May 1943, a combination of new tactics, larger numbers of escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft, radar and detection-finding technology, and the reading of German naval Enigma traffic had made U-boat losses unsustainable, forcing Admiral Donitz to largely withdraw his fleet from the North Atlantic. Though submarine operations would continue until the bitter end, the U-boat arm would never again be the formidable force it once was in the first 3 years of the war. Following the end of major U-boat operations in the Atlantic, WWII switched to developing anti-submarine tactics in support of the D-Day landings in June 1944. Once again, they were highly successful, with relatively few Allied ships being sunk by U-boats in the English Channel before the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. The Western Approach's tactical unit officially ceased operations 2 months later, having played a pivotal role in keeping the Atlantic sea lanes open and the Allied war machine marching towards victory. In recognition of their efforts in July 1945, Admiral Horton sent the following message: "On the closing down of WWII, I wish to express my gratitude and high appreciation of the magnificent work of Captain Roberts and his staff, which contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. You had a great deal to do in winning the war, because if we hadn't won the Battle of the Atlantic, we should undoubtedly have lost the war." In the summer of 1940, Britain stood balanced on a knife edge. The British Expeditionary Force had narrowly escaped the beaches of Dunkirk, and on July the 10th, the German Luftwaffe launched a massive air assault, starting what became known as the Battle of Britain. As the bombs fell, the nation braced for the inevitable German invasion, with much of the army's weapons and equipment abandoned on the coast of France. Anything and everything with the slightest chance of repelling the invaders was hastily pressed into service. Old trucks were encased in concrete to form mobile pillboxes, crude mortars, improvised flamethrowers, and even antique bathing machines were used to block major intersections, and men too old or ill to enlist in the regular forces were organized into Home Guard units armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, Molotov cocktails, and when the rifles ran out, pointed wooden staffs dubbed invasion pikes. And in one of the strangest episodes of the entire war, a group of British occultists gathered in the New Forest of Dorset in an attempt to repel the Germans through witchcraft. The bizarre incident was first described by Gerald Gardner, founder of the modern religion of Wicca, in his 1954 book Witchcraft Today. According to Gardner, the ritual took place on August 1st, 1940, near the town of Highcliffe-on-Sea on England's southern coast. This date fell on the eve of Lammas Day, a pagan harvest festival and one of the greatest Sabbats in modern Wicca. This, along with the location of the ritual in a clearing near an old gallows tree known as the Naked Man, was specifically chosen to impart greater power to the spells being cast. The New Forest Coven comprised around 17 members drawn from various esoteric societies, including the Rosicrucian Crotana Fellowship, the Co-Masons, and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In place of the traditional bonfire, which would have attracted the attention of air raid wardens or even Luftwaffe aircraft, they used a shuttered lantern or flashlight placed on the eastern edge of the clearing to direct their spells towards Berlin. Stripped naked or sky-clad, the witches then danced in circles around the clearing, chanting incantations. The ritual, known as raising the cone of power, is intended to gather and concentrate cosmic energy, which could then be focused onto a particular target, in this case, the mind of Adolf Hitler. According to Gardner, the witches did cast spells to stop Hitler landing after France fell. They met, raised the great cone of power, and directed the thought to Hitler's brain: "You cannot cross the sea, you cannot cross the sea, not able to come, not able to come," just as their great-grandfathers had done to Boney and their remoter forefathers had done to the Spanish Armada with the words go on, not able to land, not able to land. I'm not saying that they stopped Hitler. All I say is that I saw a very interesting ceremony performed with the intention of putting a certain idea into his mind, and though all the invasion barges were ready, the fact was that Hitler never even tried to come. Indeed, as Gardner states, the planned German invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, never took place, though this had far more to do with various strategic realities and tactical blunders than the intervention of witches. shocking. Nonetheless, the events of August 1st, 1940, often referred to as Operation Cone of Power, were part of a long tradition of British occultists using magic in order to repel foreign invaders. According to legend, as the Spanish Armada approached Britain in May 1588, the Vice Admiral of the English fleet, Sir Francis Drake, joined a group of sea witches on a headland called Devil's Point near Plymouth to perform a ritual intended to scatter the Spanish ships. 200 years later, another group of British witches gathered on the coast to repel the abortive 1805 invasion by Napoleon Bonaparte. While no independent sources exist for the 1940 ritual outside of Gardner's book, the story was widely accepted as true until the 1970s, when it was challenged by one Amado Crowley, who claimed to be the son and spiritual successor of infamous British occultist Aleister Crowley. Amado claimed that the incident Gardner describes is actually based on a ritual his father performed in Ashdown Forest, Sussex, in May 1941, which involved a detachment of Canadian soldiers dressed in robes and, depending on the source, either a dummy dressed in a Nazi uniform seated on a throne or a symbolic aircraft flown down a wire stretched between a church and a tree. According to Amado, the purpose of this ritual was to lure Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess to Britain. On May 10, 1941, Hess took off from Germany in a Bf-110 fighter aircraft and crossed the North Sea to Scotland. After becoming lost and running out of fuel, he bailed out and parachuted to the ground in South Lanarkshire, where he was swiftly captured by the British authorities. Hess claimed he was flying to meet with the 14th Duke of Hamilton, whom he believed to be a prominent leader in the British anti-war movement, in order to negotiate peace with Britain. However, the true reason for Hess's flight has never been fully revealed, and following his conviction on war crimes charges at the Nuremberg trials, Hess was given a life sentence in Berlin's Spandau prison, where he died, the facility's only prisoner for 20 years. In 1987. Amado Crowley further claims that his father's ritual was actually part of a large British intelligence plot known as Operation Mistletoe, cooked up by none other than Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. At the time, it was well known that several members of the Nazi inner circle were fascinated by the occult. A particular devotee was Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, who founded his own pseudo-Teutonic cult at Wewelsburg Castle and allegedly sponsored various expeditions to recover mystical relics like the Holy Grail. Though Adolf Hitler regarded Himmler's beliefs as bizarre and nonsensical, he himself was also known to engage in magical thinking. Throughout his political career, Hitler had been the victim of numerous failed assassination attempts, and his near-miraculous survival led him to view himself as an agent of Providence, destined to succeed in all his endeavors. Falling somewhere between Hitler and Himmler was Rudolf Hess, whose belief in astrology is known to have influenced his choice of May the 10th for his mysterious flight to Scotland. Aleister Crowley believed that these beliefs could be exploited, writing to the Director of Naval Intelligence in 1941 that if it is true that Herr Hess is much influenced by astrology and magic, my services might be of use to the department in case he should not be willing to do what you wish. But while Aleister Crowley's plan involved directly influencing the Nazi leadership using magic, Ian Fleming's Operation Mistletoe was far more elaborate. According to author Richard Spence, Fleming and Crowley recruited two SS officers codenamed Kestrel and Sea Eagle and brought them to Ashdown Forest to participate in various occult rituals. The officers then returned to Germany, reporting that a neo-pagan Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was alive and well among the British establishment and waiting to seize power once peace had been established. The aim of the ruse was twofold. First, to frighten the superstitious Germans into thinking they were being attacked by British witchcraft, and second, to convince Nazi Party leaders like Hess that a large underground anti-war movement existed in Britain and that peace, and even an alliance against Soviet Russia, could be brokered between Britain and Nazi Germany. This occult angle was supplemented by an elaborate campaign of misinformation aimed at convincing Hess that this fictional movement was led by the Duke of Hamilton, who was waiting to meet with him in Dungarval House in Scotland. According to this account, the setup works perfectly and Hess flew right into Fleming's trap. But as compelling as this story is, it is likely no less fictional than any of Fleming's James Bond adventures. According to historian Ronald Hutton of Bristol University, while Aleister Crowley kept extremely detailed diaries, they make no mention of any wartime rituals or even of Crowley having a son or working for British intelligence. While Crowley did offer his services to the Naval Intelligence Division in September 1939, 2 weeks after the declaration of war, this offer was ultimately turned down. Furthermore, no corroborating evidence exists for the existence of Operation Mistletoe or any similar operation, leading most historians to conclude that this was a post-war fabrication. Until the relevant government documents, if they exist, are declassified, the truth of the matter will never be known. But whether or not Crowley or other neo-pagans really did carry out witchcraft rituals during the Second World War, Gerald Gardner had good reasons for claiming that they had. According to Ronald Hutton, Gardner's books were published at a time when neo-paganism was widely associated with sexual perversion and Satanism, and stories of neo-pagans doing their bit for the war effort would have done much to rehabilitate their image, stating, "If it didn't happen, then it was a wonderful way of trying to get people to regard Wiccans as being patriotic and fellow citizens instead of being some kind of enemies of society." Gerald produced the story of Operation Cone of Power after it coped with a great deal of barracking from the media about witches being inherently evil and perverted people. So this was one very good way of explaining that they weren't. If the August 1940 Cone of Power ritual did in fact occur, then it would appear that several members of the New Forest Coven were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice in defense of their country. The coven was largely composed of members too old to enlist in the regular armed forces or even the Home Guard, and according to Gardner, the dancing involved in the raising of the Cone of Power was so intense that several participants died of exhaustion soon after. According to another account, one member, having decided beforehand to sacrifice himself, deliberately refused to cover his naked body in protective grease so that he would die of exposure. According to Professor Sabina Magliocco, an anthropologist and folklorist at California State University, Northridge says, "It tells us something about what those witches wanted to be true. It's about the power of witches to do something that is nearly impossible. It is also about the patriotism of these witches, and it also talks about the power of witchcraft to channel the energies of the earth, of nature, through their bodies to create this cone of power." And if the idea of witches using magic to fend off a Nazi invasion sounds strangely familiar, it might be because such stories are thought to have inspired author Mary Norton's children's books, The Magic Bedknob and Bonfires and Broomsticks, which later formed the basis for the classic 1971 Disney film Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Hitler, Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, even the most casual student of history knows this roster of infamous Nazis that were responsible for some of the greatest evils the world has ever known. Of the millions that were killed by German hands during World War II, countless thousands were prisoners of war. Often massive numbers of prisoners were killed at a time in acts of retaliation for the killing of German soldiers. POWs and even civilians were routinely turned over to the Gestapo for interrogation, never to be seen from again, whether or not they divulged any useful information or not. POWs would do almost anything to avoid ending up in the Gestapo's hands. In the end, Hogan's Heroes provided a less than realistic depiction of life in a POW camp. There were few bumbling, indifferent Germans like Sergeant Schultz keeping guard in the Stalag prison system. Over the decades, the image of the sadistic Nazi interrogator has become commonplace. A bright light in the prisoner's eye while he's sitting in a lone chair in the middle of a stark room. The threat or even meting out of torture always just a second away. However, violent means of Nazi interrogation were often unsuccessful. Many prisoners would endure sickening treatment but still only state basic information like name, rank, and serial number, or give bogus information to their captors. But one notable German man, who one prisoner would note could get a confession of infidelity from a nun, employed very different means of interrogation, often with much more success than with the point of a bayonet, killing them with kindness. His name was Hans Scharf, the kind-hearted Nazi interrogator. Scharf was born in 1907 in East Prussia, now part of Poland. His father, Hans Hermann Scharf, was a highly decorated soldier in the East Prussian army who was killed during the Great War. This gave the son a great sense of pride about his dad. Scharf's mother was from a family that ran one of Germany's largest textile mills, located near Leipzig, and the elder Scharf worked there prior to World War I. The younger Scharf was raised in the family villa adjacent to the textile complex. He attended school in Leipzig and studied art intensively, which would lay the groundwork for his post-World War II life. Scharf learned the ropes of the textile business, including marketing and exporting of the business's wares, and quickly moved up the company's ranks. He shipped off to the company's offices in Johannesburg, South Africa, which was supposed to last for a year, but was promoted to director of the overseas division of the textile company. Scharf remained there for nearly 10 years, during which time he met and married Margaret Stokes, a South African British woman whose father, Captain Claude Stokes, was a squadron leader in the Royal Flying Corps. The family would fall victim to very bad timing. In the summer of 1939, they were on vacation in Greiz, Germany, when World War II broke out. Unable to travel, the family was stuck there. Scharf found work in Berlin but was drafted into the German military in 1939. Thus began his odyssey to avoid being shipped off to the Eastern Front, where he was slated to be sent. Scharf's wife was indignant and hysterical about his orders, not only from a spouse's standpoint, but because Scharf was fluent in English. Thus she believed it was a tremendous waste of his skill to not at least work as a German English interpreter. She was able to make her way to a German general's office to plead her case. It's unclear how she did it unit, but whatever she did, she was convincing, and he sent a telegram to Scharf's Panzer Division ordering them to send him to the 12th Interpreters Company in Wiesbaden. The telegram arrived the morning he was to leave for the Eastern Front. But he was not out of the woods yet. Upon arriving on the train in Wiesbaden, Scharf asked the military police where his unit was located. Unfamiliar with the unit, they ordered him to report to another unit that was headed to the Eastern Front. In desperation, Scharf contacted a high-ranking German officer who had known his father, whom he had told his son to call if he was in trouble and needed an ace in the hole. The friend ordered the new Panzer unit to release him to the proper unit. At that point, he had twice avoided what would probably have been certain death in Russia. From here, Scharf was trained in British military organization and customs, but he soon became bored with his duties. He told one of his superiors that he was dissatisfied with manufacturing holes in paper and estimated the cost of each hole at 5 pfennigs. This irritated his general, but nonetheless he sent him to the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel, one of few granted this privilege to act as an interpreter for the interrogators. This was the turning point in Scharf's contribution to interrogation history. The center was where all Allied airmen captured on the Western Front were taken for interrogation. Scharf was stuck in the lower-level position, but when 2 of his superiors were killed in a plane crash, he was promoted to head of the United States Army Air Force Fighter Section. It was then that he was transferred to the Luftwaffe from the Army, though at the same rank. But here he quickly became soured on harsh interrogation techniques. Although these violent methods were largely off of the books and an official list of less drastic techniques was published, they were still the order of the day. He had witnessed these intense and violent episodes and decided that he'd do things a little differently. And so it was that Scharf would use the role of good cop to achieve his goals. Scharf first gained the trust and confidence of the captives, plying the captives with long walks in the woods, his wife's baked delicacies, casual conversations, good medical care, and even letting one POW fly a plane. Beyond all these little kindnesses, he would sell himself as their biggest advocate with his superiors. He was the one who could keep them from the Gestapo, but only if they worked with him and played ball. No Nazi dentist would dig into their gums and ask them, "Is it safe?" His methodology was as follows: get to know the POW and then allow him to talk without coercion. Along the way, Scharf pretended to know everything beforehand, but stated that his superiors insisted that the information come from the captive. Then he would either confirm that he knew the information or discontinue the conversation. This eventually became known as the Scharf method, and it was highly successful. POWs often offered up vital intelligence on their own through his trickery. No brutality, no torture, no raising of voices, no use of the Gestapo. Maybe the most classic example was Scharf suggesting to a POW that a chemical shortage caused American tracer bullets to leave white smoke instead of red. The airmen replied that this was not the case. They were white to indicate low ammunition. Naturally, this was extremely useful information for the German forces. Through his methods, Scharf was able to put together extensive dossiers on American pilots, especially the higher-ranking ones. This included information about their hometowns and families, their press clippings, and even information about common American and British pilot behavior when off-duty. As such, with all this, he was able to more easily bamboozle POWs. He was also allowed to wear street clothes, which led captives to believe he was much higher ranking than he actually was. During the remainder of the war, Scharf interrogated all manner of famous high-ranking pilots. This included Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who was the top American fighter ace in Europe in World War II. Scharf even had Gabreski's picture on the wall of his office and was thrilled to meet him. However, even Scharf's techniques could not pry information from Gabreski. He was one of the few POWs who did not provide useful information during interrogation from Scharf. This is noteworthy as it's estimated he interrogated around 500 POWs, with only a couple dozen or so providing no usable intelligence to him. Further showing how friendly he was able to get with all these prisoners, most of the men he interrogated would go on to happily sign his guest book before being transferred. As you might expect from this extreme success and rather unusual methods for the day, Scharf's public profile greatly increased after the war. Like German rocket prisoner Werner von Braun, he was useful to the United States, and because he was not an insidious Nazi, he wasn't tried at Nuremberg, nor did he have to escape to South America. In fact, in 1948, he was asked to come to the United States to interrogate Martin J. Monti, who defected to Germany in 1944. He was also asked to testify during Monti's trial. The U.S. Air Force also adapted several aspects of his methods. More recently, after controversy over enhanced interrogation techniques in the War on Terror and the uproar over alleged torture at Abu Ghraib prison, President Obama launched the FBI's High-Value Interrogation Group. It spent millions studying and presumably utilizing Scharf's methods. Scharf also continued his friendship with the aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel Gobreski after the war. The two reenacted an interrogation in 1983 at a reunion of Stalag Luft III POWs in Chicago. On that note, Scharf eventually settled in the United States and became an American citizen. The rest of his life's work has likely affected many more Americans than his interrogations. Scharf had studied art in his younger days and developed his craft into a successful business. He had a gift for mosaic-based art and furniture and found instant success with this endeavor in New York. He eventually brought the business to Los Angeles. His daughter-in-law, Monica Scharf, joined him and became his business partner for the new Scharf & Scharf company. It is still in operation today. Among their well-known works are the large mosaics of the Cinderella story in the Cinderella Castle at Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Others include mosaic entry ramps at Epcot Center, mosaics at several colleges and hotels, homes, stores, and churches around the globe. Scharf passed away in 1992 with his story living on in print. Some of his memoirs were published in a 1950 article in Argosy magazine. In 1978, military writer Raymond Tolliver collaborated with Scharf to publish the book The Interrogator, The Story of Hans Scharf, which was republished with a different company in 1997. It was a mixture of Scharf's memoirs and Tolliver's supporting biographical work. Scharf's legacy in interrogation continues to grow to this day. Scharf's tactics have been studied at length by Pars Anders Granhag, who is a professor of psychology at Sweden's University of Gothenburg. Granhag is considered the leading authority on Scharf and his techniques. As for Scharf's extreme success, Granhag states that Scharf was able to manipulate and contradict the POW's assumption about interrogation, which in turn circumvented their counter-interrogation training. Thus, the deception and new level of comfort made them ripe for the taking.